After my best friend stole my husband, I immediately filed for divorce to clear the path for her. The lawyer was stunned looking at my financial portfolio in absolute disbelief. "You make millions of dollars a year," he said to me. "Does he really not know?" I simply smiled and instructed him to prepare the trap. "My name is Paige, and I am 27 years old." I stood in the immaculate, overly perfumed hallway of a luxury downtown apartment building, holding a fresh copy of a newly drafted divorce petition. Declan, my husband of 3 years, had leased this condo 3 months ago. He claimed it was strictly for late-night client meetings and keeping his grueling corporate sales schedule separate from our quiet suburban life. He even went so far as to claim it was a necessary company expense that would guarantee his upcoming promotion to regional director. I knew it was a lie the very moment he mentioned it, but I let him play his pathetic little game. I had simply copied the spare key he kept hidden in the front pocket of his leather briefcase. I pushed the heavy oak door open. I did not bother knocking. The penthouse was flooded with bright afternoon sunlight illuminating the expensive modern furniture Declan could barely afford on his mid-level sales manager salary. And there, tangled in the imported silk sheets of the master bedroom, were my husband and my best friend Sloane. They froze immediately. Declan scrambled to pull the blanket over his bare chest, his eyes going wide with a momentary flash of absolute panic. Sloane just stared at me, clutching a decorative pillow to her chest, her face shifting rapidly from shock to a defensive, arrogant smirk. I did not scream. I did not ask how they could do this to me after years of loyalty. I did not shed a single tear. I simply walked over to the foot of the bed, opened my plain leather tote bag, and pulled out the thick manila folder. I tossed it right onto Declan's lap. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the mattress broke the silence in the room. "Sign it," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I already paid the filing fees. The bed is all yours, Sloane." Declan blinked, looking down at the legal documents resting on his legs. The panic in his eyes vanished almost instantly, quickly replaced by that familiar, arrogant sneer I had grown to despise over the last 2 years. He let out a harsh, mocking laugh, picking up the silver pen from the glass nightstand. He did not even bother to read the terms. "You are really making this easy for me, Paige," Declan said, scrawling his signature across the bottom line with aggressive, forced confidence. He tossed the folder back toward me, the pages sliding across the duvet. "I guess I should thank you." I was dreading having to explain why I was leaving a woman who spends her entire life in sweatpants. He leaned back against the tufted headboard, running a hand through his hair like he had just won a prestigious award. "Look at you. You are a glorified freelance typist. You sit at home all day clicking a mouse, making $40,000 a year, if you are incredibly lucky. You have zero ambition. I am on track to become a regional director. I need a partner who fits my lifestyle, not a hermit who drags me down socially and financially." Sloane adjusted her silk robe, leaning into Declan's shoulder and claiming her territory. She looked me up and down with absolute contempt. "Declan needs a corporate wife who can walk a red carpet, Paige," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "Not someone who dropped out of an economics degree to draw digital doodles. You gave up on your future years ago. You cannot expect a driven man like Declan to stay chained to a college dropout with no real career." Sloane leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, eager to twist the knife. "I have been taking your leftovers since high school, Paige. You thought you were so smart studying economics while I partied. Look who won. I get the luxury condo, the successful man, and the money. You get to go back to your cramped home office and cry." Declan chimed in, adjusting the blankets with a smug expression. "My firm is about to land the biggest funding deal in our history next week. Once my pitch goes through, I am making partner. I will be bringing in 7 figures. You could never fit into that world, Paige. It is better this way. You stay in your lane, and I will stay in mine." Their words were meant to cut deep. For years, my decision to leave my traditional economics program to build my own digital platform had been the favorite joke between Declan and my family. They saw my simple clothes, my quiet demeanor, and my refusal to brag about my income as proof of my absolute failure in the professional world. They thought I was a struggling artist doing low-paying gig work to barely scrape by. They had absolutely no idea that my digital doodles were actually the foundation of Apex Solutions, a massive corporate media and brand acquisition empire that I had built entirely from the ground up. They had no idea that while they were financing luxury cars at high interest rates just to look wealthy, I was acquiring commercial real estate and corporate assets worth tens of millions of dollars entirely in cash. I looked at Sloane taking in her cheap eyelash extensions and the fake designer watch on her wrist. Then I looked at Declan, a man drowning in credit card debt to maintain a pathetic illusion of success. "You two are absolutely perfect for each other," I said. My tone was icy razor sharp and completely detached. I picked up my copy of the signed divorce papers and slipped them back into my bag. "Do not worry about the rent on this condo, Declan. I know you put it on your personal credit card. You can keep the debt. Consider it a wedding gift for your bright future with Sloane." Declan scoffed, waving his hand dismissively toward the door. "Get out, Paige. Go back to your little laptop and your sad little life. We have real, adult things to celebrate." I did not give them another glance. I turned on my heel and walked out of the bedroom, my footsteps echoing heavily against the hardwood floor. The heavy front door clicked shut behind me, sealing them inside their own delusion. As I stepped into the elevator, the metal doors sliding closed to shut out the hallway, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from Richard, my lead corporate attorney, and one of the only people on earth who knew my true net worth. The message read, "Declan's tech firm just filed an urgent pitch to secure funding from Apex Solutions. His CEO is pushing hard. Do you want me to crush their proposal right now, or let them bleed first?" I stared at the glowing screen. Declan's entire career, his upcoming promotion, his illusion of extreme wealth, it all hinged on securing this massive contract. He was betting his entire professional life on impressing the anonymous CEO of Apex Solutions. He was trying to pitch his company's worth to his own wife, the very woman he had just called a useless failure. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. I typed my response, hitting send, just as the elevator reached the ground floor. Let them bleed. I drove straight to my mother Beatrice's house, navigating the winding roads of her upscale neighborhood. I needed to deliver the news of my divorce in person, foolishly believing that catching my husband in bed with my best friend might finally elicit some maternal sympathy. Beatrice lived in a sprawling suburban estate, a house she maintained meticulously to project an image of generational wealth despite constantly complaining about the property taxes. I parked my modest car in the driveway and walked up to the grand entrance. Using my key, I opened the front door and headed toward the dining room, following the sound of clinking glasses and loud laughter. I pushed the dining room doors open and froze. Sitting around the mahogany table were Beatrice, my older sister, Diana, and Sloane. They were drinking champagne, their faces flushed with amusement. Diana, the undeniable golden child of the family, was practically glowing as she examined a new designer scarf draped across her shoulders. Sloane sat right next to my mother, looking entirely too comfortable. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," Beatrice said, not bothering to hide her disdain. She did not offer me a seat. She simply looked at my plain black turtleneck and sighed heavily, as if my mere presence was an insult to her aesthetic standards. "Sloane told us everything, Paige. We know about the divorce. You know she was sleeping with my husband?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "You are drinking champagne with the woman who destroyed my marriage." Beatrice rolled her eyes, taking a delicate sip from her crystal flute. "Honestly, Paige, making $40,000 a year clicking a mouse is not a real career. You completely let yourself go. Declan is climbing the corporate ladder. He is a man with real ambition. Natural selection chose Sloane. She knows how to support a successful man. You should be happy for your sister's best friend instead of acting like a victim." Diana chimed in aggressively, adjusting the silk scarf around her neck. "Declan bought me this scarf as an early birthday present. He is so generous, Paige. Sloane is exactly what he needs. You always hated going to his corporate dinners anyway. You are just a homebody. Sloane is doing you a favor by taking him off your hands." The betrayal hit me, but it did not break me. It only solidified the emotional wall I had been building around myself for years. My own mother and sister were actively celebrating my replacement because Sloane fit their shallow, status-obsessed narrative better than I ever did. They worshipped the illusion of wealth, and Declan was exceptionally good at selling illusions. I stayed icy calm. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand apologies. I walked slowly over to the mahogany table, my eyes locked on Sloane. I picked up the bottle of champagne they were sharing. It was a cheap $20 bottle, trying desperately to pass as a luxury vintage, much like the people sitting at the table. I turned my wrist and poured the entire bottle straight into the nearby wet bar sink. The pale liquid splashed loudly against the stainless steel, draining away into nothing. "What are you doing?" Beatrice shrieked, slamming her glass down on the table. "You have no respect for anyone else's property." I set the empty bottle back down on the table with a firm thud. "Enjoy the leftovers, Sloane," I said, looking right into her panicked eyes. "You will definitely need the alcohol when the debt collectors start calling." I turned around and walked away, ignoring the chorus of insults Beatrice and Diana hurled at my back. They called me bitter. They called me a failure. They told me I would die alone in a tiny apartment while Declan became a millionaire. Let them talk, I thought. Words were cheap, and their particular brand of delusion was entirely bankrupt. As I marched down the hallway toward the front door, I literally bumped into someone stepping out of the home office. It was Jamal, Diana's husband. Jamal was a brilliant African-American forensic auditor, a man whose sharp intellect was consistently overlooked by Beatrice simply because he refused to partake in her elitist country club nonsense. Jamal and I had always shared a quiet understanding. We were the two outsiders trapped in a family of raging narcissists. "Whoa, slow down," Jamal whispered, catching my arm to steady me. He looked back toward the dining room, hearing the shrill complaints of my mother echoing down the hall. He shook his head in disgust. "I heard what happened. They are out of their minds, Paige." "I am fine, Jamal," I said, forcing a tight smile. "I just need to get out of this house before I say something I cannot legally take back." Jamal looked around carefully to ensure no one was watching us. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He slipped it directly into my coat pocket with practiced sleight of hand. "I audited his accounts last week because Diana wanted to co-sign a loan with him for a vacation property." Jamal whispered, his voice incredibly low and serious. "Declan is hiding a financial death sentence. His debt-to-income ratio is apocalyptic, Paige. He is leveraging credit lines that do not even exist yet. Burn them all." I looked up at Jamal, seeing the fierce solidarity in his eyes. He knew exactly what kind of monster Declan was, and he knew exactly how blind Beatrice and Diana were to the reality of the situation. I patted my pocket, feeling the crisp edge of the paper containing Declan's financial ruin. "Thank you, Jamal," I whispered back. "Do not thank me," he replied, adjusting his tie perfectly. "Just make sure you get good seats for the explosion." I walked out the front door, the cool evening air hitting my face and clearing the toxic stench of my mother's house from my lungs. I got into my car, pulling Jamal's paper from my pocket. It was a detailed breakdown of Declan's hidden liabilities. He was drowning in massive personal loans, high-interest credit cards, and predatory financing agreements. He had literally bet his entire life on the Apex Solutions acquisition deal going through. He needed my company to save his life. I started the engine, the low hum matching the steady rhythm of my pulse. Declan thought he had traded up. Sloane thought she had won the lottery. Beatrice and Diana thought they were backing a winner. They had absolutely no idea that the game was already over, and I owned the entire board. 2 weeks later, the air in the sleek, glass-walled conference room of my lawyer's downtown firm was practically humming with tension. I sat quietly next to Richard, my hands folded neatly in my lap. Exactly 20 minutes past the hour, the heavy oak doors swung open. Declan strutted into the room like he owned the entire building. He was wearing a brand-new, excessively tailored suit that I immediately recognized as a designer label he absolutely could not afford on his current salary. Clearly, Jamal was right about those high-interest credit cards. Beside Declan trotted his legal representation. The man was a sweaty, red-faced attorney who clutched a cheap plastic briefcase and wore too much cologne. Declan took his seat across from me, leaning back in the plush leather chair and crossing his arms with a smug, self-satisfied grin. "Let us get right to the point," Declan's lawyer barked, slapping a thin manila folder onto the polished mahogany table with unnecessary force. "My client is a rising star in the corporate tech world. His earning potential is astronomical, and he has been held back socially and financially by this marriage. We are prepared to offer a swift resolution today, provided our demands are met in full." Richard rested his chin on his hands, his expression perfectly neutral. "And what exactly are those demands?" Declan's lawyer cleared his throat, puffing out his chest. "My client will retain primary ownership of the 4-bedroom suburban property where Ms. Page currently resides. He will also be taking the Volvo SUV. Furthermore, given that my client was forced to attend vital corporate networking events alone due to his wife's refusal to participate in his career advancement, we are seeking a lump sum alimony payment to compensate for the professional damage she caused." Declan nodded vigorously in agreement, shooting me a look of feigned pity. "You never understood how the real world works, Paige. I need the house for entertaining clients. You can rent a nice little studio apartment somewhere quiet. It is better suited for your freelance typing anyway." For a moment, the room was dead silent. Then Richard did something completely unexpected in a formal mediation setting. He threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, booming, genuine laugh that echoed off the glass walls. Declan's smug grin vanished, replaced by a scowl of deep offense. "What exactly is so funny?" Richard wiped a tear of mirth from his eye and opened his sleek leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick, professionally bound document and slid it across the smooth table. It stopped perfectly in front of Declan's lawyer. "What is funny? Mr. Declan, is your profound ignorance of your own household finances," Richard said, his voice dropping to a lethal professional calm. "That suburban house does not belong to your wife. The Volvo does not belong to your wife. They are corporate assets owned entirely by an LLC formed 2 full years before your marriage ever took place." Declan frowned, leaning forward to look at the cover page. "What are you talking about?" "That LLC," Richard continued, tapping the document with his gold pen, "generates millions of dollars annually in business-to-business media acquisitions. Page is the sole proprietor and hidden founder. Because the entity was formed prior to your union and completely insulated from community property laws, you have no legal claim to it. You are entitled to absolutely nothing." I watched the color completely drain from the face of Declan's lawyer. The man's hands actually trembled as he flipped through the authenticated corporate tax returns, bank statements, and property deeds. He was a cheap lawyer, but he was not stupid. He recognized airtight legal protection when he saw it. Declan, however, was completely blinded by his own towering ego. He let out a harsh, dismissive scoff. "You cannot be serious. You actually paid this expensive suit to draft up a fake shell company. You went through all this trouble just to hide your measly freelance savings from me. That is pathetic, Paige. Even for you." His lawyer desperately grabbed his arm. "Declan, look at these numbers. These are certified federal documents. She really owns the property. We have zero leverage here." "Stop being a coward," Declan snapped, pulling his arm away violently. "It is a bluff. She sits in sweatpants all day drawing on an iPad. She does not own a multi-million-dollar corporate empire. I do not have time for these childish games. My massive pitch to Apex Solutions is next week. Once I close that deal, I will be making 10 times whatever she has hidden in her little secret savings account." Declan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, slamming it onto the table. He glared at me with absolute contempt. "I want to marry Sloane. I want to buy her the mansion she deserves. I am not spending the next 6 months fighting you in court over a used Volvo." His lawyer stared at the paper in horror. "Declan, wait. Do not submit that." It was a formal waiver of financial discovery. Declan was so incredibly arrogant and so desperate to secure his new life with Sloane that he was demanding a fast-tracked, uncontested divorce. He wanted to skip the audit process entirely, believing he was the wealthy prize and I was the financial anchor holding him down. Richard leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Declan. "I am legally obligated to warn you, sir. If you sign and submit this waiver today, you forfeit any future right to investigate my client's assets. But more importantly, you assume 100% liability for any personal debt you have acquired in your own name since the exact date of your physical separation." Declan did not even hesitate. He grabbed the pen from his lawyer's trembling hand. "I do not care. I am about to be a millionaire. Keep your little house, Paige. Keep your fake company. I am moving on to bigger and better things." He signed the waiver of discovery with a frantic, aggressive flourish and shoved it across the table toward Richard. He stood up, smoothing down his expensive, unpaid-for designer suit, looking at me like I was something scraped off the bottom of his shoe. "You are going to regret losing me, Paige," he spat. He turned and marched out of the conference room, leaving his pale, sweating lawyer scrambling to gather his cheap briefcase and run after him. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving Richard and me in absolute silence. Richard looked down at the signed waiver, then looked up at me with a slow, predatory smile. "He just legally insulated you from every single high-interest loan and predatory credit line he took out to buy Sloane's affection." I leaned back in my chair, staring at Declan's hurried signature on the paper. He had just locked himself inside a financial burning building, and he had gleefully handed me the only key to the exit. "I hope Sloane likes living in the red," I whispered. 2 days later, the smell of roasted meat and heavy floral perfume hung thick in the warm suburban air. Beatrice was hosting her annual summer barbecue, though this year it doubled as a twisted welcoming party for Sloane. I had zero intention of attending for the social aspect. I was only there to retrieve the last of my late father's belongings from the attic. My father had been the only grounded person in this family, and leaving his vintage record collection in Beatrice's dusty upstairs crawlspace felt like a betrayal to his memory. I parked my car down the street to avoid the chaotic jumble of luxury SUVs blocking my mother's driveway. Walking up the manicured front path, I could hear the loud, obnoxious laughter echoing from the backyard patio. I slipped through the side gate, hoping to bypass the crowd and head straight for the back door. Of course, in a family obsessed with appearances, going unnoticed is completely impossible. The patio was packed with aunts, uncles, and cousins holding crystal tumblers. Beatrice had rented expensive outdoor catering equipment just to prove a point to the neighbors. Sloane was standing at the center of it all, wearing an impractical white silk sundress clinging to Declan's arm like a shiny new accessory. Declan was holding court by the outdoor bar. He had rolled the sleeves of his crisp linen shirt up to his elbows, making absolutely certain that every single person in the yard could see his left wrist. A massive, heavy Rolex caught the afternoon sunlight blindingly bright. "Look at that craftsmanship," Declan said loudly, making sure his voice carried over the ambient music. "You have to reward yourself when you reach a certain level in the corporate world. It is an investment piece, really, a symbol of arriving." My older sister Diana was practically vibrating with secondhand pride. She adjusted the cheap designer scarf around her neck, the one Declan had bought her to secure her loyalty during the divorce fallout. "It is gorgeous, Declan," Diana gushed. "It just screams success." I ignored them, keeping my head down as I walked toward the back door. I just wanted my father's records. But as I reached for the handle, Jamal stepped out from the kitchen. My brother-in-law held a glass of sparkling water, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd before locking onto Declan. Jamal was a forensic auditor. His entire career was built on finding the lies people told with their money. He despised flashiness, and he had absolutely zero patience for Declan's pathetic posturing. Jamal adjusted his glasses, a slow, clinical smile spreading across his face. He walked straight over to the outdoor bar, cutting right through the crowd of admiring relatives. He did not say a word of greeting. He simply reached out and grabbed Declan's left wrist, pulling the heavy watch closer to his face. Declan flinched, trying to pull his arm back, but Jamal held firm. "Interesting piece," Jamal said, his voice carrying a calm, authoritative weight that instantly silenced the chatter around the bar. "It is a Submariner, but the bezel alignment is off by a fraction of a millimeter. You bought this from a gray market dealer down in the jewelry district, did you not?" Declan's face flushed a deep, angry red. I have no idea what you are talking about. I bought it from a certified boutique. Let go of my arm. Jamal let go, but he did not back down. He chuckled a dry, humorless sound. You did not buy it at a boutique, Declan, because a boutique requires a credit check for financing. Financing a gray market. Rolex at a 24% APR interest rate is a bold financial strategy. The entire patio went dead silent. The only sound was the sizzling of the grill. What the hell are you talking about? Declan stammered, his eyes darting nervously toward Sloane. I saw the lending inquiry on the mail you left sitting on Diana's kitchen counter yesterday. Jamal said, his tone entirely conversational, but devastatingly precise. You applied for a high-risk personal loan through a subprime lender. To get hit with a 24% interest rate on a piece of jewelry, your credit score must be resting comfortably in the low 500s. You are financing fake wealth at loan shark rates, Declan. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered relatives. Declan looked like he had been physically struck. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Sloane dropped her hand from his arm, taking a half-step back as the illusion of her wealthy prize began to crack. Before Jamal could completely decimate what was left of Declan's dignity, Beatrice swooped in. My mother descended upon Jamal like a rabid hawk, her face twisted in absolute fury. "How dare you speak to my guest that way in my home?" Beatrice shrieked, positioning herself between Jamal and Declan. "You are just jealous. You have always been jealous of Declan's success. You sit in a boring government cubicle crunching numbers all day while Declan is out there making real moves." Diana immediately rushed to our mother's side, glaring at her own husband. "Jamal, stop it. You are ruining the party. You are just trying to embarrass him because you feel inadequate." Jamal did not raise his voice. He simply took a sip of his water. "Math does not feel jealousy, Beatrice. Math just exposes the truth." Beatrice spun around, her furious gaze landing directly on me as I stood quietly by the back door. She needed a target, someone she could tear down to elevate Declan back onto his fragile pedestal. She looked me up and down, taking in my plain beige linen trousers and simple white cotton shirt. "This is your fault, Paige." Beatrice sneered, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You put Jamal up to this because you are bitter. You cannot handle the fact that Declan upgraded. Look at him. At least Declan knows how to look like a millionaire. You look like a homeless person who wandered into my backyard. You have zero class, zero ambition, and absolutely no future." No, I did not flinch. I did not defend myself. I just looked at Beatrice with a chilling emptiness. I realized in that moment that she would gladly drown on a sinking ship as long as the captain was wearing a designer suit. Humiliated by Jamal's public execution and emboldened by my mother's vicious defense, Declan puffed out his chest. He needed to reclaim his narrative. He needed to prove to everyone standing in that yard that he was the titan of industry he pretended to be. He stepped around Beatrice and raised his voice, ensuring every single aunt, uncle, and cousin could hear his grand declaration. "You want to talk about my finances, Jamal?" Declan shouted, his face still flushed with defensive rage. "I am buying Sloane a $1.5 million mansion next week. We already picked out the master bedroom. My upcoming pitch to Apex Solutions is guaranteed to make me a senior partner. I am going to be running the entire East Coast division. I do not care about a stupid credit score, because by next Friday I will be writing checks that would make you choke." The relatives murmured in awe. Beatrice clapped her hands together, throwing a triumphant, glowing look at Sloane. Sloane immediately stepped back to Declan's side, wrapping her arm around his waist and glaring at me with a victorious smirk. They all believed him. They all bought into the spectacular, fragile lie. I stood completely still by the glass door. I reached over to the patio table, picked up a cold glass of lemon water, and took a slow, deliberate sip. My eyes locked onto Declan's overconfident, sweaty face. He had just publicly anchored his entire existence, his reputation, and his future to a single corporate pitch. He was promising mansions and millions based on a deal that rested entirely in the palm of my hand. My eyes flashed with the lethal, silent intent over the rim of my glass. He was climbing a ladder that led straight to a guillotine, and I could not wait to pull the lever. I left the barbecue shortly after Jamal's mic drop moment, ignoring Beatrice's frantic attempts to save face with the neighbors. I drove straight back to my house, trading the suffocating suburban drama for the absolute quiet of my high-tech home office. This room was my true domain. It was a stark contrast to the pathetic image Declan held of me. 3 massive curved monitors stretched across a sleek standing desk, displaying real-time global market acquisitions, stock fluctuations, and secure corporate communications. I was not a freelance typist in sweatpants. As the hidden CEO and sole founder of Apex Solutions, I controlled a venture capital empire that routinely swallowed struggling tech firms whole. And Declan's company was currently bleeding out on my operating table. My encrypted phone buzzed, vibrating violently against the polished glass of my desk. I glanced down to see a message from Sloane. She had sent a selfie from what looked to be a sprawling, sun-drenched luxury real estate showing. She was posing in front of massive floor-to-ceiling windows, wearing designer sunglasses indoors, popping a champagne flute toward the camera. The caption beneath the photo was dripping with unearned arrogance, picking out the master bedroom. "Thanks for stepping aside, loser." I stared at the image, feeling nothing but a profound sense of clinical amusement. Sloane was already measuring the drapes in a house she could not afford, relying entirely on a man whose credit score was plummeting faster than his morals. I did not reply. I did not block her. I simply set the phone face down on the desk and turned my attention back to my monitors. It was time to accelerate the timeline. I opened my secure encrypted email client. Declan's firm was a mid-level tech sales operation that had been desperately courting Apex Solutions for a massive funding buyout. Without our capital injection, they were less than 30 days away from filing for bankruptcy. I drafted a message directly to Marcus Thorne, the CEO of Declan's firm. The tone I used was ruthless, exacting, and left absolutely zero room for negotiation. I wrote that Apex Solutions was currently reevaluating the risk profile of their infrastructure due to recent market volatility. I stated that we were on the verge of pulling the term sheet entirely. However, I offered them one final lifeline. To prove their sales division had the necessary aggression and leadership, their lead sales manager, Declan, was mandated to personally deliver the final acquisition presentation next Monday at 8 in the morning sharp. I made the stipulations agonizingly clear. He was to present alone. If he faltered, if his projections lacked vision, or if he failed to convince the Apex board of his intrinsic value, the deal was completely dead. I hit send, watching the encrypted message vanish into the digital ether. The snare was officially set. Less than 10 miles away, inside the overpriced luxury condo Declan was renting on credit, his afternoon of bragging was about to violently crash into reality. His phone rang, displaying his CEO's private number. Declan answered it with his usual arrogant drawl, probably expecting praise for some minor regional sale he had managed to close. Instead, the voice on the other end of the line was a panicked, sweating scream. Marcus Thorne was hyperventilating, his entire corporate life flashing before his eyes as he relayed the ultimatum from Apex Solutions. Declan paced the hardwood floor of the condo, his face draining of all color. Marcus did not mince words. He told Declan that the anonymous billionaire founder of Apex was stepping out of the shadows specifically for this meeting. The pressure was astronomical. The entire survival of the firm, the jobs of hundreds of employees, and Marcus's own golden parachute were now resting squarely on Declan's shoulders. Marcus delivered his final, crushing blow before hanging up. "If you lose this Apex deal, Declan, the company goes under. And if that happens, you are fired for cause. No severance. No recommendations. I will personally make sure you never work in this industry again." The phone clicked dead. Declan stood in the middle of the living room, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device. Sloane walked out of the bedroom, still wearing her white silk sundress, oblivious to the fact that their financial floor had just collapsed. She whined about putting down the earnest money for the mansion, demanding to know when the wire transfer would clear. Declan brushed her off his mind, spiraling into sheer panic. He walked into the bathroom and stared at his reflection in the mirror. He was terrified. He needed to project extreme wealth, unshakable confidence and corporate dominance to impress the mysterious founder of Apex Solutions. His current wardrobe was not sharp enough. He needed the down payment for the mansion to keep Sloane quiet and maintain the illusion of his success. He needed cash, and he needed it immediately. He rushed back into the living room and threw open his laptop. He checked his bank accounts. They were overdrawn. He checked his credit cards. They were maxed out to the absolute limit. Jamal's public humiliation at the barbecue echoed in his ears. Traditional banks would not even look at him. Desperate to look the part of a wealthy executive by Monday morning, Declan opened a new browser tab. He bypassed the reputable financial institutions and typed in the URL for a notoriously predatory subprime lending site. It was the kind of shadow lender that handed out massive, unsecured cash advances with astronomical, crippling interest rates and hidden fees designed to financially ruin the borrower. He needed $50,000 immediately just to cover the mansion deposit and a bespoke suit. With shaking hands and a blindingly inflated ego, Declan clicked apply, now voluntarily locking the chains around his own ankles. He had absolutely no idea he was borrowing money to fund his own execution. 4 days later, the air inside my mother's house was thick with the scent of roasted turkey sage stuffing and aggressive, overbearing floral perfume. It was Thanksgiving, a holiday supposedly dedicated to gratitude, but in Beatrice's home, it was merely an annual pageant of social hierarchy and passive-aggressive warfare. I had arrived precisely on time, viewing the dinner not as a family gathering, but as a mandatory reconnaissance mission. I needed to see exactly how far Declan's new subprime cash infusion had inflated his ego before I completely dismantled his life on Monday morning. I walked into the formal dining room and was immediately greeted by a masterclass in calculated disrespect. The long mahogany table was set with Beatrice's finest vintage silver and crystal stemware. There were 8 intricately folded cloth napkins at the main table. There were 9 people in the house, the delusion of grandeur. Sitting directly to the right of my mother in the very chair I had occupied for every major holiday since I was a child was Sloane. She was wearing a tight burgundy cocktail dress that was wildly inappropriate for a mid-afternoon family dinner. Her wrist glittering with cheap cubic zirconia bracelets she was trying to pass off as diamonds. Next to her sat Declan. He was sweating slightly under the collar of a brand-new custom-tailored charcoal suit. He had actually worn a bespoke suit to eat turkey in a suburban dining room. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to project the wealth he had just borrowed at a crippling 24% interest rate. I stood at the threshold of the room, my face a mask of absolute indifference. Beatrice looked up from arranging a silver gravy boat and gestured vaguely toward the far, dimly lit corner of the room. There was a flimsy plastic folding card table set up next to a potted fern. It was covered with a cheap paper tablecloth and accompanied by a single metal folding chair. A paper napkin and stainless steel cutlery rested on top of it. "Take a seat over there, Paige," Beatrice commanded, not even bothering to look me in the eye. We rearranged the seating chart this year to reflect the new family dynamic. The main table is for people who actually contribute to society. Declan and Sloane are building a massive future together. They need to be front and center, you understand? Diana chimed in from across the room, aggressively adjusting her pearl earrings. "It makes perfect sense, Paige. Declan is about to become a senior partner at his firm next week. He is pitching to Apex Solutions. He is practically corporate royalty now. You are just doing your little digital drawings. You do not need to be at the adult table." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply nodded, walked over to the flimsy folding chair and sat down. From my vantage point in the corner, I had a perfect unobstructed view of the entire room. I watched as they gorged themselves on food and delusion. Declan spent the entire first half of the meal bragging loudly about his upcoming Monday morning meeting. He boasted about how Apex Solutions was going to hand him a blank check, how his CEO practically worshipped him, and how he was already looking at yacht club memberships. Jamal sat quietly across from him, sipping his water, occasionally shooting me a look of profound shared exhaustion. Jamal knew Declan was drowning in toxic debt, But even he did not realize the full extent of the trap waiting for Declan on Monday, the Crimson Assault. By the time the main courses were cleared, Sloane was deeply intoxicated. She had been gulping down glasses of an expensive heavy red wine that Declan had proudly presented as a hostess gift paid for with his predatory loan. Sloane stood up, her balance slightly unsteady, holding her crystal wine glass filled to the brim. She locked eyes with me across the room, a malicious, arrogant smile stretching across her face. She walked slowly toward my folding table, her heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floor. The conversation at the main table died down as Beatrice and Diana turned to watch the spectacle. Sloane stopped right in front of me, leaning over my cheap plastic table, invading my personal space. "It is such a shame you gave up on your marriage, Paige." Sloane slurred her breath, reeking of fermented grapes. "But I guess you just could not handle a man with real ambition. We are closing on a $1.5 million estate next month. You could never give him that kind of life." I looked up at her, my expression utterly blank. I was wearing a simple, unbranded beige cashmere sweater. It was spun from rare Loro Piana wool and cost more than Sloane's entire wardrobe combined, but to their untrained brand-obsessed eyes, it was just plain, boring clothing. Sloane sneered, shifting her weight. As she did, she deliberately tilted her wrist. A thick wave of dark red wine cascaded over the edge of her crystal glass, splashing directly onto my chest. The dark crimson liquid immediately soaked into the pristine beige cashmere, spreading rapidly across the fine fabric in a massive, glaring stain. Sloane gasped, pressing a manicured hand to her mouth in a terrible display of mock horror. "Oops," she giggled, her voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "I am so clumsy. Good thing it is just a cheap mall sweater. You can buy another one for $10. The quiet move. Total silence fell over the dining room. At the main table, Beatrice and Diana erupted into cruel, synchronized laughter. Declan leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with a smug, pitying smirk. They were all waiting for the explosion. They were waiting for me to scream, to cry, to run out of the room in a dramatic display of humiliation. They wanted me to break. I did not give them the satisfaction. I did not gasp. I did not stand up. I calmly picked up my cheap paper napkin and gently dabbed at the dark red stain blooming across my chest. My heart rate did not elevate a single beat. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my encrypted smartphone, and opened a secure messaging channel to Marcus, my lead executive personal assistant. I typed a single sentence: "Bring the reserve garment to the Fairfield address immediately." I hit send, placed my phone face down on the plastic table, picked up my fork, and calmly resumed eating my turkey. Diana pointed at me, her laughter echoing sharply off the walls. "Look at her. She is not even going to defend herself. Absolute pathological cowardice." Beatrice sighed heavily, taking a sip of her wine. "It is pathetic, really. She has absolutely no spine. This is why you are alone, Paige. You let the world walk all over you, the arrival. I let them talk. I let them bathe in their toxic superiority. I chewed my food methodically, counting the minutes in my head. I knew the exact distance from my downtown corporate penthouse to this suburban street. I knew exactly how fast my security detail drove. Exactly 15 minutes later, the sharp, heavy crunch of heavy tires on gravel interrupted Declan's latest monologue about his fictional yacht. The deep, guttural purr of a massive engine vibrated through the dining room windows. Jamal frowned, standing up and walking over to the front window. "What in the world is that?" he asked, pulling back the sheer curtain. A sleek, armored black Cadillac Escalade SUV had pulled directly onto Beatrice's immaculate front lawn, bypassing the crowded driveway entirely. The vehicle looked like it belonged to a visiting head of state. Before anyone could process what was happening, 3 sharp, authoritative knocks hammered against the solid wood of the front door. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. Beatrice froze, setting down her fork. "Who on earth could that be?" she muttered, standing up and smoothing down her dress. She marched into the foyer and pulled the heavy front door open. Standing on her porch was a towering, broad-shouldered man wearing a razor-sharp tailored black suit and a discreet earpiece. It was Marcus. He looked completely out of place on a suburban porch, radiating an aura of intense professional intimidation. In his right hand, he held a sleek, heavy matte black garment bag emblazoned with the subtle logo of a private, ultra-exclusive Italian design house. Marcus did not smile. He did not introduce himself to my mother. He looked right past Beatrice, his piercing gaze scanning the dining room until he found me sitting at the folding table in the corner. For Ms. Page, Marcus announced, his deep voice carrying a terrifyingly formal weight that instantly silenced every single person in the house. "Your replacement garment has arrived." Marcus walked straight past my mother without a single glance in her direction. He moved with the predatory, silent grace of a man who handled high-level corporate security and logistics for a living. The hardwood floor did not even squeak beneath his polished Oxford shoes. He navigated the crowded dining room, cutting through the sea of staring relatives, and came to a halt right beside my flimsy plastic folding table in the corner. He unzipped the matte black garment bag with a smooth, practiced motion. Inside was a breathtaking, perfectly tailored cashmere coat in a deep, rich shade of charcoal. It radiated an undeniable quiet luxury that immediately made the entire room look cheap by comparison. Marcus carefully helped me remove the ruined wine-stained sweater, folding it away before draping the new cashmere coat over my shoulders. It fit flawlessly, falling with a heavy, elegant grace. "Your replacement coat, ma'am," Marcus stated, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "The $15,000 has been charged to the corporate account as requested. Shall I have the stained garment incinerated?" "Yes, Marcus, thank you," I replied, adjusting the collar of the new coat. "You can return to the office. I will handle things here." Marcus bowed his head respectfully, zipped up the ruined sweater in the bag, and marched right back out the front door. The heavy click of the latch echoed like a gavel striking wood. For a long, agonizing moment, the dining room was completely dead silent. You could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then Beatrice snapped out of her paralyzed shock. Her face turned a violent shade of red, a mixture of profound embarrassment and sheer, unadulterated rage. She marched into the dining room, her hands on her hips. "What kind of ridiculous stunt is this, Paige?" Beatrice demanded, her voice shrill and echoing off the walls. "Did you rent a coat and hire a struggling actor just to look important at my Thanksgiving dinner?" Diana chimed in immediately, letting out a harsh, nervous laugh as she clutched her own cheap designer scarf. "A $15,000 coat. Please. You probably got it from a thrift store or a knockoff website. You are a freelance graphic designer who sits at home all day. You do not have a corporate card. You do not have a personal assistant. You are just trying to ruin Sloane's big day because you are bitter." Jamal stepped away from the front window, shaking his head. He walked slowly over to my corner of the room, his eyes fixed on the charcoal fabric draped across my shoulders. Jamal was a man who lived and breathed fine details. He did not care about family politics or suburban drama. He cared about facts. "May I?" Jamal asked politely, gesturing toward my sleeve. I extended my arm. Jamal adjusted his glasses, leaning in closely to inspect the stitching along the cuff. He checked the subtle hand-woven tag concealed on the inner lining of the wrist. He let out a low, appreciative whistle, stepping back and turning to face my mother and sister. "This is not a rental, Beatrice," Jamal said, his tone clinical and absolute. "And it is certainly not a knockoff. This is a bespoke piece from Milan. I audited a luxury importer last year who dealt exclusively with this specific designer. They do not sell these in malls, and they do not lease them out for suburban dinner parties. Only 10 of these exist in the entire United States." The blood drained from Beatrice's face. Diana opened her mouth to argue, but Jamal cut her off with a sharp look. "I know what real wealth looks like, Diana." Jamal continued, his voice leaving no room for debate. "And I know what it costs. That coat is worth more than the car parked in your driveway." He turned back to me, his eyes narrowing in intense analytical curiosity. "Paige, who exactly are you working for?" The entire family stared at me. Sloane looked absolutely furious, her face contorted in a jealous sneer. The cheap cubic zirconia bracelet suddenly looked incredibly heavy and ridiculous on her wrist. Her wine-spilling triumph had been completely overwritten, entirely erased by my casual, effortless display of massive financial power. I looked dead at Declan and Sloane. My expression was icy calm and completely detached from the emotional circus unfolding around me. "I do not work for anyone, Jamal," I said, letting the words hang in the heavy air of the dining room. "People work for me." Declan let out a loud, forced scoff, slamming his hand down on the table to break the tension. "Right," he sneered, puffing out his chest in his unpaid-for suit. "You are secretly a billionaire. And I am the King of England. Stop embarrassing yourself, Paige. You are a glorified typist playing dress-up. You are just trying to distract everyone from the fact that I am buying a $1.5 million mansion next week." Despite his aggressive words, a visible bead of sweat formed at his temple. His eyes kept flicking toward the front window where the armored black SUV had just pulled away. He was trying to project dominance, but the illusion was cracking. Before Declan could launch into another desperate monologue about his fictional wealth, the tense silence was shattered by the sharp ringing of his cell phone. He pulled it out of his pocket, looking annoyed at the interruption, but his face went completely pale when he saw the caller ID. It was Marcus Thorne, his CEO. Declan stood up abruptly, clearing his throat and attempting to paste on a confident expression. He answered the phone, stepping slightly away from the main table. But the house was so incredibly quiet, and his CEO was shouting so loudly that the frantic, panicked voice bled clearly through the receiver for everyone to hear. Declan, the CEO, screamed, his voice high-pitched and frantic with existential corporate dread. "I just got off a secure call with the Apex Solutions acquisition team. The timeline has shifted. The meeting is no longer a preliminary review. It has been moved to Monday at 8 in the morning sharp." Declan stammered, running his free hand through his hair. "Sir, Monday, we need more time to prepare the projections. We need to polish the deck." "Listen to me, you idiot," his boss roared, cutting him off completely. "The anonymous founder of Apex Solutions is flying in personally to oversee your presentation. This is not a drill. This is the final test. The founder wants to see if our sales leadership actually has teeth. If they do not like what you have to say, they are pulling the term sheet entirely. The entire company goes under. Do not screw this up." The line went dead with a harsh click. Declan stood frozen in the middle of Beatrice's formal dining room, the phone slipping slightly in his sweaty palm. His hands were visibly shaking. He looked at Sloane, who was staring at him with wide, demanding eyes, waiting for reassurance about her luxury mansion. Then he looked at me. He had absolutely no idea that the anonymous founder his boss was terrified of was sitting right in front of him, wearing a $15,000 coat and waiting for the final execution. Declan slowly lowered the phone from his ear, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device onto the hardwood floor. The terrified screams of his CEO were still echoing in the dead silence of my mother's dining room. He looked at me then, at the immaculate $15,000 cashmere coat draped over my shoulders, his brain completely unable to process the shifting reality of the room. But Declan did not have time to worry about my coat. His entire fake empire was crumbling under his feet. Sloane, oblivious to the absolute panic suffocating her future husband, tugged sharply on his sleeve. She whined about the real estate agent complaining that the escrow account for their new luxury mansion was still empty. She loudly demanded to know when the wire transfer was going to clear. Declan swallowed hard beads of cold sweat gathering at his hairline. He had already blown the entire $50,000 subprime loan on his bespoke suit, the fake Rolex, and paying off his immediate overdue credit card minimums to avoid collections. He had absolutely zero liquidity. He did not have the money for the mansion. He did not even have the money to pay for the gas in his rented car. Declan plastered a sickeningly sweet, entirely fake smile onto his pale face and gently guided my mother away from the main table. He led Beatrice into the kitchen, shutting the heavy wooden door behind them. I remained at my folding table, taking a slow sip of my water, watching through the glass panes of the French doors as the desperate manipulation unfolded. Inside the kitchen, Declan laid his trap. He played the victim perfectly. He told Beatrice that his bank accounts were temporarily frozen because of my vindictive divorce tactics. He claimed I was tying up his massive corporate wealth out of pure jealousy. He then promised Beatrice that if she could just bridge the gap and lend him the $100,000 down payment for the mansion escrow, he would pay her back double. He swore on his life that the moment the Apex Solutions deal closed on Monday morning, he would hand her a check for $200,000. Beatrice was the perfect mark. She was blinded by her obsessive hatred for me and her desperate, pathetic need to associate with high society. She did not ask for a contract. She did not ask to speak to his accountant. She simply pulled out her phone and logged directly into her retirement portal. Beatrice deliberately and voluntarily liquidated her entire 401k savings. Every single penny she had worked her entire life to save, she transferred into Declan's personal checking account. Diana pushed open this kitchen door just in time to hear the end of the transaction. Instead of stopping our mother from making the worst financial mistake of her life, Diana clapped her hands in delight. She hugged Beatrice, praising her loudly. "You are so smart, Mom," Diana gushed, glaring at me through the glass. "You are investing in a real winner. Declan is going to take care of us when he makes partner. You are securing our family's future." Jamal had been standing near the kitchen island the entire time, pouring himself a fresh glass of iced tea. He watched the digital wire transfer clear with absolute disgust. Jamal walked out of the kitchen, shook his head, and came straight over to my corner of the dining room. He leaned down, keeping his voice incredibly low. "Your mother just wired him $100,000, Jamal whispered, his eyes dark with warning. "She liquidated her entire retirement fund. He promised her a 100% return on investment by next week. He is bleeding her dry page." I set my water glass down. I felt no pity for Beatrice, but a lingering sense of familial duty compelled me to offer her one final solitary chance to save herself. I stood up from my cheap plastic chair and walked into the hallway, intercepting my mother as she left the kitchen. "Cancel the wire transfer right now," I said, my voice completely stripped of emotion. "Declan is lying to you. He does not have frozen assets. He has a mountain of toxic debt. If he loses his corporate pitch on Monday, he will be fired for cause. You will never see a single cent of that retirement money again. You are throwing your life savings into a black hole." Beatrice stopped dead in her tracks, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She stepped into my personal space, her eyes blazing with a deranged, fanatical loyalty to a man who was actively robbing her blind. "How dare you speak to me about financial responsibility?" Beatrice snarled, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "You are just jealous. You cannot stand the fact that another woman is getting the luxury life you threw away. You are a bitter, pathetic little girl trying to sabotage a successful man because you know you will never measure up to him." Beatrice leaned in closer. She literally spat the next words at my face, a fine mist of saliva hitting my cheek. "Declan is a dragon page. He is a titan, and you will always be a useless, invisible worm crawling in the dirt." I did not wipe my cheek. I did not blink. I stared into the eyes of the woman who had birthed me, realizing that there was absolutely nothing left to save. "You made your choice," I said softly. I turned on my heel and walked straight out the front door, leaving the house, the toxic Thanksgiving dinner, and my entire biological family behind me for good. I slipped into the back of my waiting corporate SUV, sinking into the plush leather seats. Just as the driver pulled away from the curb, my encrypted phone buzzed. It was a text message from Jamal. As a forensic auditor, Jamal had an incredible talent for looking over shoulders and memorizing routing numbers. He had tracked the immediate destination of Beatrice's wire transfer. Jamal sent a single screenshot of Declan's digital banking receipt accompanied by a brief, devastating message. He did not put the money in escrow. He never called the real estate agent. He just wired the entire $100,000 to a luxury car dealership downtown. He used your mother's retirement fund to buy Sloan a Porsche. I locked the screen of my phone and looked out the tinted window at the passing suburban streets. The trap was fully loaded. Monday morning was going to be an absolute bloodbath. The weekend before that impending bloodbath was supposed to be a quiet period of strategic preparation, but my family had an uncanny inability to leave well enough alone. Diana, still seething over the fact that a single bespoke coat had completely shattered the illusion of her superiority, decided to launch a preemptive strike. She genuinely believed I was a struggling, emotionally fragile freelancer, and she wanted to ensure I suffered for embarrassing them. On Saturday morning, my secure phone alerted me to a massive spike in social media mentions. Diana had taken to Facebook, LinkedIn, and several local neighborhood networking groups to post a sprawling, unhinged manifesto. She tagged my public decoy freelance profile in every single post, ensuring maximum visibility among local businesses. Her essay was a masterpiece of suburban delusion. She painted me as a lazy, bitter, financially dependent wife who had spent years dragging Declan down. She claimed I refused to work leached off his hard-earned success and was currently engaging in toxic stalker-level behavior because I had been rightfully replaced by a younger, better woman. Diana specifically urged local business owners not to hire me, stating that my negative energy, lack of professional drive, and unstable mental state would ruin any project. She garnered hundreds of likes, comments from sympathetic gossiping housewives and a barrage of fake outrage. She thought she had delivered a fatal blow to my livelihood. She thought she was kicking a peasant back into the mud. She had absolutely no idea she was poking a sleeping leviathan. I did not cry. I did not post a frantic emotional rebuttal. I simply sat at my multi-monitor workstation and had my corporate tech security team rip every single byte of data from the platforms. They pulled timestamps, IP addresses, engagement metrics, and localized sharing data. They bound it all into a meticulously organized digital and physical dossier. By Sunday afternoon, I was sitting in the corner office of Richard Sterling. Richard was the most ruthless, feared litigator in the city, and he was on a permanent astronomical retainer for Apex Solutions. His office was a testament to predatory legal power, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass black marble floors and cold steel fixtures. I slid a thick leather-bound binder across the polished marble surface of his desk. Richard adjusted his glasses, flipping through the first few pages. He read Diana's completely fabricated claims regarding my professional competence and mental state. He did not smile, but his eyes gleamed with the sharp, predatory thrill of a lawyer who had just been handed a slam-dunk case on a silver platter. "I want her completely neutralized," I stated, my voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "Draft an immediate cease and desist letter, and have it served to her by a uniformed courier today. File a defamation lawsuit seeking $500,000 in compensatory and punitive damages. And file an emergency restraining order against my sister based on targeted documented cyber harassment." Richard nodded, slowly closing the binder with a heavy thud. "The paperwork will be drafted and filed before the courts open tomorrow morning. We will freeze her bank accounts the moment we secure the preliminary judgment. She will not be able to buy a cup of coffee without asking our permission." "Perfect," I replied. But Richard did not dismiss me. Instead, he buzzed his intercom. His lead private investigator, a former federal agent named Vance, stepped into the office. Vance had been running continuous deep-dive background checks on everyone connected to Declan since the acquisition talks began. Vance walked over and dropped a slim, unmarked manila folder right on top of Diana's defamation binder. "We followed the money from your mother's wire transfer," Vance explained, keeping his posture rigid and professional. "Jamal was right about the Porsche. Declan bought it outright in cash. But we kept digging into the new fiancé. Sloane is not who she claims to be." I opened the folder. The first page was a highly detailed financial routing schematic. It showed Declan's overdrawn accounts, the predatory subprime loan deposit, and Beatrice's liquidated retirement funds. But there was a secondary hidden layer to the transaction history. "Sloane has comprehensive access to Declan's accounts," Vance continued. "Over the past 3 weeks, she has been systematically siphoning off chunks of his borrowed capital. She is doing it in precise increments, specifically designed to avoid triggering standard banking alerts. She is not using the money to plan a wedding or pay for a mansion." I traced my finger along the printed routing numbers. "Where is the money going?" "It is being routed through a shell corporation registered in Delaware," Vance replied. "From there, it is being wired directly into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, an account registered solely in Sloane's name." I turned the page reviewing Sloane's actual background profile. There was no degree from a prestigious university. There was no family money. Sloane was a professional grifter with a long documented history of attaching herself to insecure middle management men, bleeding their credit dry, and vanishing the moment the collections agencies started calling. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew Declan was a hollow fraud, drowning in toxic debt. She was extracting every single cent she could get her hands on, including my mother's entire life savings, before the inevitable bankruptcy hit. Declan thought he had traded up for a trophy wife who validated his massive ego. Beatrice thought she had invested her retirement into a golden couple destined for high society. Diana thought she was protecting a rising corporate star. Instead, they had all willingly handed their entire financial futures over to a con artist who was already packing her parachute. Sloane was not just a homewrecker. She was a predator preparing to jump ship the absolute second Declan's corporate illusion shattered, and I was the one holding the detonator. I left Richard Sterling's office with the heavy, unassailable weight of absolute leverage resting quietly in my briefcase. The knowledge of Sloane's offshore Cayman account was the final, devastating puzzle piece I needed. She was not merely a vapid opportunist clinging to my ex-husband's fading coattails. She was a calculated financial predator, actively draining the last remaining drops of blood from a dying host. I walked the 2 blocks from the corporate legal district to my usual morning sanctuary, a minimalist high-end cafe that specialized in quiet luxury and imported single-origin roasts. The cafe was a haven of polished concrete dark walnut tables and the low, steady hum of espresso machines. It was populated by people conducting serious, quiet business. There were no flashy logos, no loud conversations, just the discreet rustle of financial newspapers and the soft clinking of porcelain cups. I sat at my preferred corner table, opened my laptop, and began reviewing the preliminary injunctions Richard was currently filing to freeze my sister's assets. I was entirely focused, my heart rate steady, my mind calculating the precise fallout of the upcoming week. The heavy glass door of the cafe swung open, completely shattering the hushed professional atmosphere. I did not need to look up from my screen to know exactly who had just walked in. The sharp, aggressive, and entirely uncoordinated clicking of stiletto heels echoed sharply against the polished concrete floor. Sloane marched into the room as if she were stepping onto a red carpet. She had clearly gone out of her way to track my location, likely monitoring my daily routine in a desperate, pathetic bid to assert her newly perceived dominance. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses indoors, a massive faux fur coat draped aggressively over her shoulders, and carrying a heavy leather handbag emblazoned with a garish, recognizable logo. She reeked of stale morning alcohol and heavy, overly sweet floral perfume. She bypassed the line entirely and marched directly to my corner table, refusing to offer a greeting. Instead, she reached into her oversized bag, pulled out a thick, heavy envelope, and slammed it down onto the wooden surface directly over my keyboard. I slowly lowered my laptop screen and stared down at the heavy ivory cardstock. It was blindingly embossed with tacky, excessive gold foil. Sloane ripped off her sunglasses, her eyes wide with a manic, unearned triumph. "We are getting married on a yacht next month," Sloane announced, her voice pitched perfectly loud to ensure that every single surrounding table was forced to stop their conversations and listen to her. "I want you there to see what a real woman looks like." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I did not blink. I did not react. I simply observed her. She was vibrating with a toxic mixture of adrenaline, profound insecurity, and absolute delusion. Sloane leaned heavily over the table, planting her manicured hands flat against the wood, bringing her face mere inches from mine. A vicious, ugly smile curled her lips as she prepared to deliver what she believed was the ultimate killing blow. "I have been taking your leftovers since high school," Sloane hissed, her voice dripping with a decade of suppressed, one-sided rivalry. "You always thought you were incredibly superior. You thought you were so wonderfully smart, locking yourself in the library, studying economics, building your boring little resume, while I actually partied and lived my life. You looked down on me. But look who actually won, Paige." She tapped a long acrylic nail sharply against the gold foil invitation. I get the sprawling luxury mansion, Sloane continued, her eyes gleaming with manic satisfaction. I get the powerful corporate man. And I get the money. You get to sit alone in a coffee shop playing on your laptop while my life becomes a literal fairy tale. I looked from the gaudy invitation back to Sloane's triumphant, desperate face. The irony was so dense it was practically suffocating the air out of the room. She was bragging about a luxury mansion that was currently unfunded. She was bragging about a powerful corporate man who was currently drowning in a tidal wave of toxic subprime debt. And she was bragging about money she was actively embezzling into a shell corporation before the entire house of cards collapsed. She honestly believed she was standing victorious at the finish line, completely unaware that she was tap dancing on a landmine I had already armed. I did not raise my voice. I reached out and calmly picked up the heavy gold-embossed invitation. The cardstock was thick, designed to feel substantial, permanent, and expensive. I held her gaze, my expression completely void of any emotion. I gripped the edges of the card and smoothly, deliberately tore it perfectly in half. Sloane's jaw dropped, her eyes widened in absolute shock. Before she could process the insult or utter a single word of protest, I reached over and dropped the two torn halves directly into her sweating plastic cup of iced latte. I watched the expensive paper immediately begin to dissolve, the tacky gold foil sinking into the milky brown liquid. A piece of advice, Sloane? I said, my voice dropping to a clinical, razor-sharp whisper that cut through her delusion. Do not spend money you do not hold in your hands. The blood rushed violently to Sloane's face. Her neck flushed a deep mottled red. She snapped her head around, realizing that several wealthy patrons at the adjacent tables had completely paused their quiet business meetings to watch her public humiliation. Desperate to reclaim her shattered dignity and definitively prove her newly acquired wealth to the staring room, she spun around on her stilettos and marched directly to the barista counter. Give me your absolute most expensive pastry, Sloane snapped, gesturing aggressively toward the glass display case. Actually, I am buying out the entire top row. Box it all up right now. She reached into her oversized handbag and proudly pulled out a sleek, heavy metal credit card. It was Declan's premium executive account card, the specific piece of plastic he used to project his fake corporate status to the world. She slammed the heavy metal onto the granite counter with a loud, aggressive clatter. The barista, a young woman with tired eyes and zero interest in Sloane's theatrical display, picked up the metal card and smoothly inserted the chip into the terminal. The machine processed for an agonizingly long moment. The entire cafe was dead silent, waiting for the transaction to clear. Then the terminal emitted a sharp, undeniable, high-pitched beep. The barista looked down at the digital screen, frowned slightly, and then looked back up at Sloane. Her expression shifted into a mask of highly uncomfortable, deeply humiliating pity. I am sorry, ma'am, the cashier said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet room as she slid the heavy metal card back across the granite counter. The card is declined. Insufficient funds. Sloane snatched the useless piece of premium metal from the cashier's hand, her manicured fingers trembling with absolute unfiltered rage. Her face flushed a deep mottled crimson as the quiet murmurs of the surrounding patrons amplified her profound public humiliation. She did not look back at me. She did not attempt to salvage her boxed pastries. Sloane turned on her stilettos and practically fled the cafe, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind her, sealing her devastating defeat. I remained at my corner table, taking a slow, calm sip of my coffee. The financial rot had officially breached the surface, and the final countdown had begun. By Saturday morning, the weekend before the massive Apex Solutions presentation, the infection within Declan's fabricated life reached critical mass. His boutique consulting firm was in a state of absolute unmitigated chaos. I sat in my home office, receiving real-time encrypted updates from Vance, who was actively monitoring the frantic digital communications echoing out of Declan's rented workspace. The facade of the brilliant corporate strategist was violently peeling away, revealing the terrified, incompetent fraud underneath. Declan was pacing his office, screaming at his subordinates over conference calls. He was threatening to fire his junior analysts because the pitch deck lacked the requisite polished data, completely ignoring the fact that he had provided them with absolutely no viable metrics to work with. He was visibly unraveling. His business phone was ringing incessantly, but it was not lucrative clients eager to close deals. It was a relentless, overlapping swarm of aggressive debt collectors demanding immediate payment on his severely delinquent accounts. The humiliation Sloane had suffered at the coffee shop acted as the final spark to the powder keg. Declan returned to his leased luxury apartment that evening and finally turned his mounting rage onto the woman he had abandoned me for. He screamed at Sloane, his voice echoing through the thin walls of their overpriced rental. He demanded to know exactly why his premium corporate executive card had bounced for a $10 pastry. More importantly, he demanded to know where the $100,000 wire transfer from Beatrice had gone. He desperately needed that capital to secure the mansion escrow and appease the frantic real estate agents who were actively threatening to pull the deal. Sloane played her part with the terrifying perfection of a seasoned grifter. She wept dramatically. She played the helpless victim. She claimed the bank had flagged the massive transfer and temporarily frozen the funds due to suspicious activity, explicitly blaming the freeze on my supposedly vindictive divorce lawyers. She lied directly to his face, perfectly concealing the fact that Beatrice's life savings were already resting comfortably in a Cayman Islands shell account under her sole control. Declan, blinded by sheer panic and his own monumental ego, swallowed the lie whole. He had no other choice but to believe her. Across town, the collateral damage of Declan's collapsing empire was hitting the family home. Jamal had reached his absolute limit. He drove to my mother's house, walking straight through the front door with a thick stack of freshly printed financial statements gripped tightly in his hand. He found Diana and Beatrice sitting comfortably in the living room, casually sipping tea and discussing the interior design choices for Declan's mythical new luxury mansion. Jamal did not hesitate. He dropped the banking records directly onto the coffee table, the heavy thud shattering the suburban tranquility. He looked at my mother with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. "Beatrice, you have exactly $412 left in your checking account," Jamal stated, his voice ringing with grim, undeniable finality. "You gave everything to a man who just bounced a credit card payment at a coffee shop. You are ruined." Beatrice stared down at the printed numbers, the color rapidly draining from her face as the horrifying reality began to set in. But Diana instantly leaped to her feet, her face twisting into an ugly mask of fanatical denial. She snatched the financial printouts from the table and threw them back at Jamal. She pointed a trembling finger at him, screaming that he was a jealous, pathetic liar. She claimed he was manipulating bank records to help me ruin Declan's stellar reputation. She loudly insisted that titans of industry frequently experience temporary cash flow issues while restructuring massive capital assets. Diana willfully chose absolute delusion over glaring printed reality. Jamal simply shook his head, turned his back on my sister, and walked out of the house, officially washing his hands of their self-inflicted destruction. Despite Diana's loud, aggressive reassurances, a cold, suffocating panic had finally clawed its way into Beatrice's mind. The first of the month was rapidly approaching. Her mortgage payment was due, and her retirement accounts were entirely liquidated. Desperation breeds a very specific toxic type of audacity. My encrypted phone buzzed late Saturday afternoon. I looked at the caller ID, feeling a cold wave of disbelief wash over me. It was Beatrice. I answered the call, remaining completely silent, waiting for her to speak. Beatrice did not apologize. She did not acknowledge the horrific things she had screamed at me during Thanksgiving dinner. Instead, her voice took on a demanding, deeply entitled tone. She rapidly explained that she was experiencing a minor temporary banking delay and demanded that I wire her a gift of $5,000 immediately to cover her mortgage. She framed it not as a desperate loan, but as a mandatory tribute I owed her for the privilege of being her daughter. She actually believed I would blindly comply. I let her finish her frantic, demanding monologue. The silence stretched over the cellular line, heavy, sharp, and entirely unforgiving. "Ask the dragon you invested in. I replied, my voice echoing with glacial absolute detachment. The worm has nothing for you. I disconnected the call and permanently blocked her number. Sunday evening descended over the city, carrying with it the quiet, heavy atmosphere of a looming execution. Inside his rented apartment, Declan stood squarely in front of his bathroom mirror. He rigorously adjusted the knot of his bespoke silk tie, plastering a confident, highly rehearsed, predatory smile onto his pale face. He spent hours practicing his corporate pitch, perfecting the exact hand gestures and empty buzzwords he planned to use to dazzle the mysterious old billionaire who supposedly owned Apex Solutions. He smoothed his lapels, entirely convinced of his own brilliant superiority and inevitable victory. He had absolutely no idea he was walking straight to the slaughterhouse. Monday morning arrived with the crisp, unforgiving clarity of a predator waking for the hunt. At exactly 8 o'clock, Declan strode through the towering revolving glass doors of the Apex Solutions headquarters. He walked into the sprawling multi-level atrium as if he already owned the building. He was wearing the bespoke midnight blue Italian suit he had purchased using the very first tranche of my mother's liquidated retirement funds. The fabric draped perfectly over his shoulders, a stolen armor designed to project wealth he did not possess. He felt entirely invincible. He approached the vast black marble reception desk and slammed his leather briefcase down completely, disregarding the young woman manning the station. He barked his name, demanding immediate escort to the top-floor executive suite. He treated her with the casual, dismissive cruelty of a man who believed he had finally ascended to the ruling class and no longer needed to pretend to respect the working staff. The receptionist, who had been fully briefed on the exact parameters of the morning's schedule by my security team, did not flinch. She simply offered a tight, highly professional smile, handed him a visitor pass, and pointed him toward the private elevators. Declan rode the express elevator to the penthouse level, stepping out into a massive panoramic glass boardroom that seemed to float above the city skyline. The room was designed for intimidation. It featured a 30-foot mahogany table, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district, and an atmosphere of absolute clinical power. His own CEO, an aging, perpetually stressed man named Arthur, was already there. Arthur and the 3 senior board members of their boutique consulting firm were pacing the length of the room. They were sweating profusely, frantically reviewing their printed pitch decks and constantly adjusting their ties. They looked exactly like men preparing to face a firing squad. Arthur immediately pulled Declan aside, his voice dropping to a frantic, panicked whisper. He explicitly warned Declan to drop the arrogant hotshot facade immediately. Arthur stressed that the founder and majority shareholder of Apex Solutions was a notoriously ruthless, fiercely private billionaire who could dissolve their entire firm and seize their assets with a single signature. They were drowning in debt, and this acquisition pitch was their singular final lifeline. Arthur begged Declan to be respectful, compliant, and perfectly deferential. Declan scoffed, brushing a speck of invisible dust from his stolen lapel. He smugly assured Arthur that he knew exactly how to handle high-level corporate titans. He arrogantly claimed that his manufactured charisma and aggressive pitching style were exactly what an old, out-of-touch billionaire would respect. He was entirely convinced that he was the star of the show, the savior who would single-handedly rescue their failing company. The heavy floor-to-ceiling frosted oak doors at the far end of the boardroom remained firmly shut. The delay was a calculated psychological tactic, and it was working perfectly. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The silence in the room was agonizing. Arthur was visibly shaking, repeatedly dabbing his damp forehead with a linen handkerchief. Declan paced the length of the mahogany table, aggressively checking his fake Rolex, feigning annoyance at the delay to mask his own bubbling anxiety. The pressure cooker was fully sealed. Suddenly, the electronic lock on the double doors chimed a sharp, clear note. The massive oak doors swung open in perfect synchronization. I walked into the room. I was flanked on my right by Richard Sterling, whose mere presence in a boardroom usually signaled an impending corporate massacre. On my left were 2 of my senior executive vice presidents carrying thick binders of financial forensics. I was wearing a razor-sharp charcoal-tailored suit that projected absolute uncompromising authority. The cut was merciless, the fabric impeccable. I did not look at the men scrambling to their feet. I did not offer a greeting. I walked with deliberate, measured steps across the length of the boardroom, bypassing the long side of the table entirely. I moved straight to the head of the table and sank into the massive, high-backed, black leather executive chair. I deliberately kept the chair swiveled toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning my back entirely to the room. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to stand there waiting, suffocating in their own nervous anticipation. The sheer weight of the power dynamic was crushing them into the carpet. Arthur practically bowed, his voice trembling with a potent mixture of profound reverence and absolute terror. He cleared his throat twice before he could manage to speak. "Thank you for seeing us," Founder Arthur stammered, addressing the back of my leather chair. "We are deeply honored by your time. We understand the acquisition parameters are strict, and we are prepared to offer full transparency regarding our recent restructuring." I did not answer him immediately. I let the silence hang for another excruciating 10 seconds, letting the fear fully saturate their bloodstreams. Then I placed my hands on the armrests. I slowly, deliberately swiveled the heavy leather chair around to face the room. The color instantly violently drained from Declan's face. His smug, practiced corporate smile vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. His knees physically buckled, hitting the edge of the heavy mahogany table as his brain desperately tried and failed to process the impossible shifting reality of the room. He stopped breathing. He locked eyes with me, staring in absolute paralyzed shock at the woman he had discarded, the woman he thought was a struggling, pathetic freelancer. He was staring directly into the eyes of the apex predator, finally realizing he had just walked himself onto the killing floor. Declan physically stumbled backward, his expensive stolen leather shoes slipping awkwardly against the polished marble floor. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table just to keep himself upright. His mouth opened and closed silently several times, resembling a suffocating fish pulled onto dry land. He looked frantically around the vast boardroom, his eyes darting toward the ceiling corners, genuinely searching for hidden cameras. His desperate mind clung to the only narrative it could process, convincing him this was an elaborate, cruel prank orchestrated by his competitors. "Paige, what are you doing here?" Declan finally stammered, his voice cracking into a high, reedy pitch that completely shattered his manufactured corporate baritone. "How did you get past security? Get out of this room right now. You are going to ruin my pitch." He actually stepped forward, raising his hand, as if he were going to physically shoo me away like a nuisance. He looked wildly at Arthur and the other board members, attempting to salvage his crumbling authority. "I apologize, gentlemen," Declan said, forcing a sickly, terrified laugh. "This is my ex-wife. She is currently going through a severe mental health crisis. I will have security escort her out immediately so we can begin the presentation." I did not even look at him. I treated him exactly like the insignificant, invisible insect he was. I kept my eyes locked entirely on his CEO. Arthur was standing frozen, his face chalk white, his gaze darting between my tailored suit, the executives flanking me, and the terrifying presence of Richard Sterling standing silently at my shoulder. Arthur was a seasoned corporate veteran. He did not need a formal introduction to understand the absolute shift in gravity. He knew exactly who held the power in the room, and he knew instantly that his hotshot sales manager had just committed a fatal, catastrophic error. "Arthur," I said, my voice cutting through the room with the smooth, clinical precision of a scalpel, "let us dispense with the theatrical presentations. My acquisitions team has spent the last 3 months rigorously analyzing your firm's infrastructure client retention models and operational frameworks." I paused, steepling my fingers on the desk. Arthur swallowed hard, nodding rapidly, completely ignoring the frantic, confused sputtering coming from Declan's side of the table. "Your core infrastructure is remarkably solid," I continued, keeping my tone perfectly even. "Your proprietary data analytics algorithms hold significant market value. However, your executive oversight is severely compromised. Your lead sales manager is not a rising star. He is a toxic, catastrophic liability who poses an immediate threat to the integrity of this acquisition." Declan's face contorted with outrage. He slammed his hand onto the table. "How dare you speak to my CEO?" Declan yelled, his panic morphing into blind, desperate rage. "You are a freelance nobody. You have absolutely no authority in this building. Arthur, she is lying. Throw her out." I did not raise my voice. I did not acknowledge his outburst. I simply reached out and took the thick, heavily redacted dossier from the executive vice president standing to my left. I casually tossed the heavy binder across the polished mahogany surface. It slid with a satisfying heavy hiss, stopping directly in front of Arthur. "Open it," I instructed. Arthur's hands visibly shook as he opened the cover. Declan leaned over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the top page. The color that had rushed to his face in anger instantly drained away again, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. "Inside that dossier, you will find comprehensive, legally verified forensic accounting of Declan's entire professional and personal existence," I stated, my voice echoing like ice in the dead silent room. "You will see that he has systematically falsified client acquisition metrics for the past 4 quarters to artificially inflate his commission bonuses. He has lied on multiple disclosure forms. He carries an extreme, unsustainable amount of high-interest personal debt, including predatory subprime loans used to finance the suit he is currently wearing, and the fake Rolex on his wrist." Declan instinctively covered his left wrist with his right hand, stepping back from the table as if the binder had physically burned him. Arthur rapidly turned the pages, his eyes widening in horror as he absorbed the sheer scale of the financial ruin documented before him. Furthermore, I continued, leaning slightly forward, projecting absolute suffocating authority. "He recently coerced an elderly woman into liquidating her entire retirement fund, transferring $100,000 into a personal checking account to cover his mounting toxic debt. His ethics are non-existent. His professional credibility is a complete fabrication. He is a financial predator, and if you retain him, his impending bankruptcy and inevitable criminal fraud investigations will permanently infect your corporate brand." The silence that descended upon the boardroom was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating, and utterly complete. The only sound was the frantic, shallow breathing coming from Declan's chest as his entire world violently collapsed around him. He looked at Arthur, his eyes begging for support, begging for the older man to defend his star employee. "Arthur," Declan whispered, his voice trembling with sheer terror. "Arthur, none of that is true. She fabricated those documents. I am your top earner. You need me to close this deal." I held Arthur's gaze, ignoring the pathetic whimpering of the man I used to call my husband. I delivered the final crushing blow. "Apex Solutions is prepared to acquire your company for $40 million effective today." I announced, the number hanging in the air with massive, undeniable gravity. "We will assume all operational debts, retain your core staff, and integrate your analytics team into our global infrastructure. It is a highly lucrative exit strategy that will save your firm from imminent insolvency." I let the weight of the money settle over the board members. I saw the desperate relief flash in their eyes. Then I dropped the guillotine. "But I have one absolute non-negotiable condition," I said, my voice hardening into solid steel. "Declan is to be terminated immediately. He is to be fired for cause, citing the gross ethical violations and falsified metrics detailed in that dossier. He will receive 0 severance pay. He will forfeit all unvested stock options. He will receive absolutely no corporate recommendations or references from this firm. If you agree, Richard will slide the acquisition contracts across the table right now. If you hesitate, I will walk out of this room and I will let your firm burn to the ground." The choice was not a choice at all. It was $40 million of salvation versus the employment of a proven fraud. Arthur did not hesitate for a single second. The corporate loyalty Declan had so arrogantly relied upon evaporated instantly. Arthur slowly closed the dossier, his face a mask of absolute unforgiving corporate survival. He did not consult his board members. He did not ask for a moment to deliberate. He turned slowly to his left and looked directly at Declan. "You are fired," Arthur said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth or hesitation. "Get your things and leave my building immediately." The air vanished from Declan's lungs. A harsh, ragged wheeze tore through his throat as the absolute finality of Arthur's words registered in his brain. The grand illusion he had so desperately constructed over the past year shattered into a million jagged pieces upon the polished marble floor. He physically swayed his hands, clawing at the edge of the heavy mahogany table, desperate for a stabilizing anchor that no longer existed. His bespoke midnight blue suit suddenly looked absurd, a hollow, expensive costume draped over a terrified, bankrupt fraud. He snapped his head back toward me. His eyes were completely bloodshot wild with the frantic, untethered energy of a cornered animal, realizing the trap had permanently snapped shut. He looked at my perfectly tailored suit, the loyal executives flanking me, and the sheer, unassailable power I commanded from the head of the boardroom table. The intense cognitive dissonance was actively breaking his mind. Then the arrogance completely broke. The smug facade dissolved. The mighty corporate strategist, the man who had abandoned me for a younger, flashier model and mocked my career violently, collapsed under the weight of his own hubris. Declan dropped directly to his knees. The loud crack of his joints hitting the floor echoed sharply through the cavernous boardroom. "Page, please!" Declan gasped. He was actively hyperventilating now, his chest heaving as hot tears of sheer panic spilled down his pale face. "You cannot do this to me. I have a massive mortgage. I have luxury car payments. I have private loans. We used to be married, Paige. Please, I am begging you. Do not take my job." I leaned back in the high-backed leather chair, neatly steepling my fingers. I looked down at his pathetic, trembling form. There was no anger left in my chest. There was no sadness, no lingering attachment, and absolutely no pity. There was only the clinical, satisfied observation of a toxic parasite finally being neutralized. He was begging a woman he had systematically belittled, a woman he had replaced, a woman he had assumed would quietly fade into the background of his glorious upward trajectory. "You chose Sloane," I stated, my voice echoing with the absolute temperature of deep winter ice. "You chose the fake lifestyle. You chose the toxic debt." I shifted my gaze entirely past his kneeling, sobbing form and locked eyes with the two massive, broad-shouldered security personnel standing just outside the frosted glass doors. I gave a single definitive nod. "Security, remove this trespasser," I commanded. The heavy double doors swung open instantly. The two guards moved into the room with silent, brutal efficiency. They each grabbed Declan firmly under the armpits, hauling him off the premium carpet with effortless, terrifying force. Declan thrashed wildly, his expensive leather shoes scraping frantically against the floorboards. "No, wait! I need this job!" Declan screamed, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical shriek of pure desperation. "Arthur, tell her. I am your top earner. Paige, you owe me." His pathetic protests were violently cut short as the guards dragged him backward out of the executive suite. The heavy oak doors swung shut, sealing with a definitive, satisfying click, instantly cutting off the sound of his complete destruction. The boardroom descended back into a state of pristine, highly professional silence. I turned my attention back to the massive mahogany table. Arthur and his senior board members stood completely frozen, staring at the closed doors, their faces ashen, processing the ruthless execution they had just witnessed. They were terrified, but they were also desperate to survive the impending financial slaughter. "Gentlemen," I said, bringing their focus immediately back to me, "let us finalize this transaction." I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and retrieved a heavy, solid gold fountain pen. Richard Sterling stepped forward, sliding the massive stack of acquisition contracts directly in front of me. He flipped perfectly to the signature page. I did not hesitate. I pressed the gold nib to the thick paper and signed the $40 million acquisition agreement, officially absorbing their entire firm into the Apex Solutions empire. The second my pen lifted from the final line, the crushing tension in the room snapped. Arthur exhaled a massive, shuddering breath of profound relief. The executive vice presidents flanking me began to clap. Within seconds, Arthur and his remaining board members joined in the room, erupting in a loud, echoing round of enthusiastic applause. They were clapping for their corporate salvation, entirely willing to step over Declan's professional corpse to secure their own survival. I remained seated, smoothly capping my gold pen, my expression calm, composed, and utterly victorious. 30 floors below, the triumphant applause of the executive boardroom, reality was delivering a very different, deeply brutal verdict. The security guards hauled Declan through the grand atrium, completely ignoring the shocked stares of the mourning corporate crowd. They pushed aggressively through the revolving glass doors and unceremoniously threw him onto the cold, unforgiving concrete of the city sidewalk. Declan hit the ground hard. His knees scraped against the rough pavement, tearing the pristine fabric of his custom Italian suit. He scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily, his hair wildly disheveled, his face flushed with extreme public humiliation. Pedestrians actively stepped around him, casting disgusted glances at the grown man, having a highly visible breakdown in the middle of the financial district. He frantically patted down his pockets, his fingers trembling violently. He pulled out his smartphone. He desperately needed Sloane. He needed the $100,000 wire transfer. If he had that money, he could still salvage the mansion, he could still maintain the illusion of wealth, he could still survive the week. He frantically selected Sloane's contact and pressed the call button. He pressed the phone to his ear, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. It rang once. Then it clicked directly to a harsh automated voicemail. Declan pulled the phone away, staring blankly at the digital screen. A cold, nauseating dread began to pool heavily in his stomach. He dialed her number again. Straight to voicemail. He dialed a third time, his thumb mashing the screen. Voicemail. The horrifying realization slammed into him with the force of a freight train. She was not having a banking delay. She was gone. His hands shook so violently he could barely unlock his phone screen. He aggressively navigated to his primary banking application. He needed to verify the accounts. He needed to see the raw numbers. The loading screen spun for an agonizing, endless 3 seconds. Then the dashboard materialized. Declan stopped breathing entirely. Every single account displayed on the screen was locked. A bright, glaring red banner dominated the top of the interface, notifying him of an immediate total freeze due to massive delinquency and suspected fraudulent activity. Below the warning banner, his combined balances stared back at him. The accounts were completely drained and severely overdrawn by exactly $150,000. The luxury apartment, the cars, the lifestyle, it had all been a fragile house of cards, financed by predatory credit, and the final pillar had just been violently kicked away. A sharp digital ping echoed from the phone clutched in his sweating hand. A high-priority email notification dropped onto his lock screen. It was an automated message originating directly from Arthur's Human Resources Department. Declan opened it, his eyes desperately tracking the clinical, unforgiving text. His termination was effective immediately. His premium corporate health insurance was permanently severed. His executive expense accounts were permanently closed. Furthermore, the email clearly stated that the company car he had leased under the firm's name was scheduled for immediate repossession by the end of the current business day. He had absolutely nothing left to his name. Before he could even process the complete eradication of his fabricated corporate identity, a second notification banner slid across his cracked screen. It was a digital calendar alert, programmed weeks in advance, ringing with the cruelest possible timing. Declan stared at the glaring reminder. His final binding divorce hearing was scheduled to begin in exactly 3 hours. The reality of the digital calendar alert glowing on his cracked phone screen forced Declan to physically drag himself off the concrete pavement. The 3 hours between his absolute corporate execution and his mandatory court appearance dissolved into a frantic, hyperventilating blur. He had desperately wandered the financial district, repeatedly refreshing his frozen banking applications, calling Sloane's dead voicemail, and violently denying the undeniable truth. His entire fabricated existence had collapsed, leaving him with absolutely nothing but the ruined custom Italian suit clinging to his sweating back. The courtroom. I sat at the petitioner's table inside the municipal family court, the polished oak surface cool and grounding beneath my hands. Beside me, Richard Sterling was the absolute picture of lethal predatory calm. He methodically adjusted his silver cufflinks, his sleek leather briefcase neatly organized with the devastating documents that would serve as Declan's final financial autopsy. The courtroom was eerily quiet, the air thick with the heavy clinical scent of floor wax and impending judgment. The heavy double doors at the back of the room suddenly swung open with a violent, echoing bang. Declan practically fell through the threshold. He was a horrific, jarring contrast to the smug, polished executive who had confidently strutted into the Apex Solutions headquarters just hours prior. He was drenched in a foul, nervous sweat. His breathing was ragged and loud in the quiet room. His midnight blue blazer was visibly scuffed with city grime from his fall on the sidewalk, the expensive fabric wrinkled and ruined. His silk tie hung completely undone around his collar. He scrambled into the room and immediately spun around frantically, scanning the empty wooden benches in the public gallery. His bloodshot eyes darted back and forth, desperately searching the shadows. He was clearly expecting Sloane to walk through those doors right behind him, ready to offer her unwavering support, her fake designer bags, and a miraculously fabricated plan to save him. The gallery remained completely, utterly empty. Sloane was already gone, actively liquidating his mother's stolen life savings in a jurisdiction far entirely beyond his reach, the legal annihilation. Declan stumbled heavily toward the respondent's table, sinking into the wooden chair next to his attorney. His legal representation was a discount high-volume divorce lawyer he had clearly retained on a rapidly dwindling credit limit. The man wore an ill-fitting, shiny gray suit and possessed a nervous, sweaty demeanor that inspired absolutely zero confidence. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for possessing zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, banged her gavel and called the proceedings to order. She adjusted her reading glasses and began reviewing the asset declarations and the pre-separation LLC documentation Richard had meticulously submitted to the clerk weeks in advance. Declan's lawyer stood up, clearing his throat with a loud, nervous rasp. He immediately launched into a desperate, wildly unprofessional last-minute pivot. "Your Honor!" the lawyer stammered frantically, gesturing toward his ruined client. "We formally request that the court entirely restructure the proposed asset division and award my client immediate substantial spousal support. Mr. Sterling has just been wrongfully terminated from his high-level executive position a mere 3 hours ago. He is currently destitute and entirely reliant on his soon-to-be ex-wife's newly discovered vast financial empire." I did not blink. I did not shift in my chair. Richard Sterling stood up smoothly, buttoning his tailored jacket with glacial precision. He approached the bench and handed the judge a single, perfectly preserved document. It was the heavily weighted, aggressively ironclad legal waiver Declan had arrogantly signed months ago. Back when he firmly believed my boutique agency was a failing, pathetic little hobby. He had enthusiastically and legally waived any and all rights to my business assets, fully convinced he was protecting his own fabricated wealth from my perceived failure. Counselor Richard said, his voice ringing with absolute clinical authority. "My client's corporate holdings are entirely protected under Section 3 of this pre-separation agreement, which your client signed of his own free will, waiving all rights to spousal support and business equity." The judge took the document, her eyes scanning the highlighted clause. She looked down at Declan's lawyer with an expression of profound, unfiltered professional pity mixed with deep irritation. The waiver was absolute. Declan's lawyer sputtered weakly, attempting to argue that the document was signed under false pretenses regarding my actual corporate net worth. Richard countered instantly and effortlessly. He stated that Declan's sheer arrogance and utter failure to perform basic financial due diligence did not invalidate a legally binding contract. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Richard continued, placing a secondary thick file onto the judge's bench, "we have provided comprehensive forensic audits proving the respondent actively siphoned marital funds to finance his mistress's luxury lifestyle, including premium vehicle leases and international travel, long before the legal date of separation." The verdict. Declan sat paralyzed, his mouth hanging slightly open as the final nails were driven into his coffin. The judge held up her hand, instantly cutting off the desperate, frantic stammering from Declan's table. She banged her heavy wooden gavel with a sharp, undeniable crack that sealed his fate forever. "The divorce is final," the judge declared, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. She read the absolute terms directly into the official court record. "I retained 100% of my business empire, my personal accounts, my physical assets, and my investments." Declan was legally individually assigned 100% of the toxic debt he had secretly acquired during the final deceptive months of our marriage. This assignment included the remaining massive balance on Sloane's luxury Porsche, the predatory personal loans he had taken out to maintain his fake executive lifestyle, and the massively overdrawn credit accounts utilized for the unfunded mansion down payment. Every single financial grenade he had primed had just been legally strapped directly to his chest. The judge neatly stacked her papers. She lowered her glasses and fixed her gaze entirely on Declan. She looked at the sweating, disheveled, broken man with unfiltered, raw disgust. "You are legally bound to repay $150,000 in personal liabilities, sir," the judge stated, her voice dropping to a sharp, icy whisper that cut through the silent room. "Good luck without a job." The last remaining drop of color vanished from Declan's face entirely. The sheer crushing magnitude of his absolute ruin finally shattered the final pillar of his massive ego. He physically collapsed forward into his wooden chair, burying his face deep in his trembling hands, and began weeping uncontrollably. I left the suffocating atmosphere of the courtroom without a single backward glance at the weeping, broken man I had once called my husband. Richard Sterling and I stepped into the crisp afternoon air, the silence between us vibrating with absolute victory. The legal amputation was complete. We took a private car, the short distance back to his premium downtown law firm, to finalize the asset protection filings. I felt lighter than I had in years, my mind already organizing the integration of Declan's former firm into the Apex Solutions portfolio. The heavy mahogany elevator doors slid open at the penthouse reception level, instantly shattering my newfound peace. The typically hushed, intimidating silence of Richard's elite lobby had been violently replaced by shrill, aggressive screaming. Paralegals and junior partners stood frozen in the glass-walled corridors, staring in absolute shock at the spectacle unfolding by the front desk. Standing directly in front of the horrified receptionist were my mother and my sister. Beatrice looked entirely unrecognizable. Her usually immaculate, heavily hairsprayed bob was wild and unkempt. Her expensive cashmere coat was buttoned incorrectly, hanging askew over a wrinkled blouse. She was vibrating with a frantic, animalistic panic, her face flushed and twisted in desperation. Diana stood right beside her, acting as her aggressive enforcer, her features contorted into a mask of ugly, self-righteous rage. They were completely unaware of the corporate bloodbath that had occurred that morning, or the absolute legal annihilation that had just concluded in family court. As soon as Beatrice spotted me stepping out of the elevator, she lunged forward. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face, her voice echoing shrilly off the polished marble walls. She demanded that I instruct Richard to release my divorce settlement immediately. She screamed that the bank had just called her, explicitly stating that her mortgage payment had bounced and the grace period was officially over. Foreclosure proceedings were imminent. She brazenly claimed I owed her the $100,000 she had lent to Declan. In her severely distorted reality, she insisted it was my moral and legal responsibility to fix the banking delay because he was my husband, entirely disregarding the fact that she had funded him specifically to help him leave me for Sloane. The sheer, blinding audacity of her demand was staggering. She actually expected me to hand over my own wealth to cover the fraudulent loan she had gleefully given to the man who betrayed me. I did not even have to open my mouth to respond. A tall, imposing figure rose smoothly from the deep leather sofa in the waiting area. It was Jamal. He had texted me an hour earlier, asking to meet at Richard's office to discuss securing legal representation for a deeply personal matter. Now I understood exactly what that matter was. Jamal stepped squarely between me and my screaming family. He physically blocked Diana and Beatrice, his broad shoulders creating an impenetrable wall. He looked at my mother with absolute freezing contempt. His normally patient demeanor was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. "Are you completely deaf?" Jamal demanded, his voice booming with undeniable authority that instantly silenced my mother's shrieking. "I told you Declan was a fraud. I brought you the financial statements. You chose to ignore reality. You willingly handed an unsecured massive wire transfer to a cheating liar, and you did it for no other reason than to spite Paige." Beatrice gasped, clutching her purse to her chest as if Jamal had physically struck her. She stuttered desperately, clinging to her delusion, insisting that Declan was a successful executive experiencing a temporary liquidity issue. Jamal cut her off without a shred of mercy. "Under United States law, that money is legally gone." Beatrice Jamal stated, his words falling like heavy stones on the marble floor. "You gave an unsecured loan without collateral to a verified scammer. The cash is sitting in an offshore shell account, entirely untraceable. There is no magical banking delay. There is no pending mansion. You dug your own grave and you bankrupted yourself." Diana's face flushed a deep, furious purple. She could not handle seeing her mother publicly humiliated or her own twisted worldview dismantled. She slammed her hands aggressively against Jamal's chest, screaming at him to shut his mouth. She demanded that he act like a real man and defend his family. She ordered him to force me to hand over the settlement money, screaming that blood loyalty meant supporting Beatrice no matter what. Jamal did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked down at his wife with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that signaled the absolute end of their marriage. He slowly shook his head, reaching into the inner pocket of his heavy wool coat. He pulled out a thick sealed manila envelope and pressed it firmly against Diana's chest, forcing her to take it. "I am defending my family," Jamal said, his voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp whisper that carried perfectly across the silent lobby. "I am entirely done dealing with a family of toxic narcissists. These are formal separation papers, Diana. I am filing for sole physical and legal custody of our son. I will not stand by and let you turn my boy into a monster exactly like your mother." Diana stood completely paralyzed, her mouth hanging open in absolute shock. The aggressive fire vanished from her eyes, replaced by a sudden, terrifying emptiness. She stared down at the heavy manila envelope in her trembling hands, her brain struggling to comprehend the massive permanent shift in her reality. Jamal did not wait for a response. He turned his back on his wife, walked straight past Beatrice, and stepped into the open elevator. He hit the lobby button and the heavy doors slid shut permanently, cutting him off from the toxic wasteland of my family. The silence that rushed back into the reception area was suffocating. The absolute finality of Jamal's departure acted as the final catalyst. Beatrice's knees physically buckled under the crushing weight of her absolute financial ruin. She collapsed directly onto the cold marble floor, her expensive coat pooling around her like a discarded shroud. She clutched her empty designer purse to her chest and began weeping hysterically, wailing as the terrifying reality of her utter destitution finally set in. Diana remained frozen above her, staring blankly at the legal documents in her hands, realizing with absolute horrifying clarity that her blind, venomous loyalty to our mother had just cost her the only good man she had ever known. Miles away from the shattered remnants of my family weeping in Richard's lobby, Declan dragged his exhausted, ruined body through the city streets. He had staggered out of the municipal courthouse in a complete daze, entirely oblivious to the harsh afternoon wind cutting through his torn, custom-tailored suit. His mind was a skipping record trapped in a relentless loop of the judge's final decree. He owed $150,000. He had no job. He had no corporate backing. His accounts were entirely frozen. But as he blindly navigated the crowded sidewalks, a desperate, pathetic spark of denial ignited in his chest. He still had Sloane. Sloane was young, beautiful, and fiercely devoted to their shared vision of a high society future. She would know exactly what to do. Her father had connections in private equity. She had friends in elite social circles. She would wrap her arms around him, tell him it was merely a temporary setback, and together they would exact their revenge on me. He clung to this delusion like a drowning man clutching a razor blade. He just needed to get back to the luxury leased condo. He needed his sanctuary. Declan finally reached the towering glass facade of his premium residential building. He pushed through the revolving doors, completely ignoring the sharp, suspicious glare the concierge directed at his disheveled appearance. He practically threw himself into the private elevator, aggressively mashing the button for the penthouse level. The rapid ascent made his stomach heave, but he forced himself to breathe. He mentally rehearsed his speech. He would tell Sloane that I had manipulated the courts, that it was a gross miscarriage of justice, but that he would bounce back stronger than ever. The heavy elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Declan stepped into his private foyer and pushed open the massive double doors to the condo. Sloane. "Baby, I am home," Declan called out, his voice cracking with desperate manufactured optimism. "We have a massive problem, but we are going to fix it." The only response was a hollow, terrifying echo. Declan froze. The air in the apartment felt completely wrong. It was stale, entirely devoid of the expensive floral perfume Sloane constantly sprayed. He stepped further into the grand entryway and turned the corner into the expansive open-concept living room. The breath violently left his lungs. The sprawling, magnificent condo was completely, brutally bare. The massive custom white velvet sectional sofa was gone, leaving deep, permanent indentations in the premium carpet. The towering 80-inch flat-screen television had been aggressively ripped from the wall mounting. The expensive modern art he had purchased on credit to impress her friends had vanished, leaving pale rectangular shadows on the pristine paint. "No," Declan whispered, his eyes wide with rising horror. "No, no, no." He broke into a frantic run, his leather shoes slapping loudly against the bare hardwood floors. He burst into the master bedroom. It was stripped to the bone. The king-sized mattress was stripped of its silk sheets. He threw open the doors to the massive walk-in closet. The entire right side, previously overflowing with the designer bags, imported shoes, and haute couture dresses he had financed with toxic debt, was entirely empty. A few cheap wire hangers swayed mockingly in the draft from the open door. He scrambled to the hidden wall safe behind the full-length mirror. The heavy steel door was hanging wide open. The emergency cash, the expensive watches, the jewelry, every single item of value had been professionally and thoroughly extracted. Declan backed out of the closet, his chest heaving as a cold, paralyzing sweat broke out across his forehead. He sprinted back down the hallway toward the kitchen, his mind desperately grasping for any logical explanation. A robbery, a moving company error, anything but the glaring, horrific truth staring him in the face. He reached the front entryway and looked at the brass key hook mounted by the door. The keys to the brand-new top-of-the-line Porsche he had leased exclusively in his name for her birthday were gone. He stumbled into the kitchen, gripping the edge of the cold marble island to keep his legs from collapsing. Sitting perfectly in the exact center of the vast, empty granite counter was a single folded piece of thick, expensive stationery. Declan reached out his hand, trembling so violently he could barely pinch the paper. He slowly unfolded it. The handwriting was elegant, looping, and unmistakably Sloane's. There were no teardrops on the page. There were no declarations of enduring love. It was written with the absolute clinical precision of a seasoned predator executing a flawless exit strategy. Declan read the words and his entire reality completely dissolved. "I needed a man who could fund my lifestyle, not an unemployed loser with a 500 credit score. Thanks for the Porsche. Oh, and I canceled the yacht wedding and kept the deposit. Like I told Paige, I always win." The heavy stationery slipped through his numb fingers, fluttering gently to the floor like a dead leaf. The sheer agonizing weight of his own stupidity crushed him. Sloane had never loved him. She had never admired his business acumen or his manufactured corporate persona. She had accurately identified a weak, arrogant, insecure target, and she had systematically bled him dry. While he was busy mocking my ambition and flaunting his new flashy trophy, the trophy was quietly draining his accounts, packing her bags and preparing to disappear the second the money ran out. She had monitored his downfall, secured her exit capital, and vanished like a ghost, leaving him holding the massive radioactive bag of debt. In the dead, suffocating silence of the empty condo, a sharp, piercing ring shattered the air. Declan jumped, startled, out of his paralysis. His phone was vibrating violently in his suit pocket. He pulled it out, his eyes struggling to focus on the cracked screen. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dimming afternoon light. It was Beatrice. He swiped to answer, pressing the phone to his ear with a shaking hand. He did not even have the chance to say hello. "Declan, you absolute bastard!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice a hysterical, unhinged wail of pure terror and rage that forced him to pull the phone away from his ear. "Where is my money?" "The bank is foreclosing on my house." Jamal left Diana. "You promised me double returns. You swore on your life that the loan was secure. Give me back my $100,000 right now, or I swear I will have you thrown in prison." Declan stood completely frozen. He listened to the frantic, sobbing screams of the woman who had happily funded his betrayal, the woman who had actively conspired to ruin my life, now demanding a salvation he was completely incapable of providing. They had both believed they were the smartest people in the room. They had both believed they could outmaneuver me. Now they were both standing in the absolute wreckage of their own greed, completely destroyed by the very arrogance they had wielded like a weapon. He could not form a single word. His throat was entirely, completely closed. He slowly opened his hand, letting the smartphone drop from his grasp. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack, spinning away into the shadows. Beatrice's tinny, desperate shrieks continued to echo from the small speaker, a pathetic soundtrack to his ultimate demise. Declan sank slowly to his knees, the rough fabric of his torn suit pulling uncomfortably against his skin. He slid all the way down until he was sitting flat on the cold floor of the empty, darkening apartment. He pulled his knees to his chest and wrapped his arms tightly around his legs. As the sun dipped below the city skyline, plunging the stripped condo into absolute darkness, the horrifying, irreversible truth finally settled into his bones. He had thrown away a flawless, invaluable diamond for a worthless piece of glittering trash, and now he was entirely, utterly alone. 2 months later, the absolute destruction of Declan's world had quietly faded into the background of my own relentless ascent. The acquisition of his former firm had been a flawless, highly lucrative integration that solidified Apex Solutions as an untouchable force in the corporate sector. I was not looking backward. I was entirely focused on the future. Unfortunately, the ghosts of my past were actively refusing to stay buried. The fallout from Beatrice and Diana's toxic arrogance had been swift, brutal, and completely absolute. The bank had officially foreclosed on Beatrice's sprawling, immaculately decorated suburban home. The heavy wooden doors she had once proudly slammed in my face were now bolted shut with bright yellow eviction notices taped to the glass. She had lost everything. Diana's reality was arguably even worse. Jamal had executed his legal separation with the same calm clinical precision he applied to his corporate litigation. He had effortlessly secured primary custody of their son, leaving Diana financially decimated and legally cornered. My sister, the woman who had spent her entire life sneering at my perceived inadequacies from the comfort of her husband's wealth, was now living in a cheap, neon-lit motel on the outskirts of the city. A significant portion of her meager minimum wage paycheck was automatically garnished every 2 weeks to pay Jamal child support. They had both hit rock bottom, completely destroyed by their own blind worship of status. It was a freezing, torrential Tuesday afternoon when they finally reached the absolute limit of their desperation. I stepped out of the private executive elevator into the grand glass-walled lobby of the Apex Solutions headquarters. The towering atrium was a fortress of polished marble and brushed steel. Outside, a violent rainstorm was battering the city pavement, turning the financial district into a miserable gray blur. I was flanked by my senior executive assistant, who was quietly briefing me on our upcoming international expansion, and my personal security detail, a towering, fiercely professional man named Marcus. As Marcus pushed open the heavy revolving glass doors and seamlessly deployed a massive black umbrella over my head, 2 disheveled figures violently broke away from the shadows of the building's exterior alcove. Beatrice and Diana rushed forward through the blinding rain. They looked absolutely horrific. My mother's once pristine hair was plastered flat against her skull, dripping freezing rainwater down her pale, completely unlined face. Her cheap, thin raincoat was entirely soaked through. Diana trailed slightly behind her, looking hollowed out, shivering violently in the bitter wind, her eyes darting nervously toward Marcus's imposing bulk. They had clearly been standing out in the freezing downpour for hours, desperately waiting to ambush me at the end of the business day. "Paige?" Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking over the loud roar of the city traffic and the heavy rain. "Paige, please stop. You have to listen to me." Marcus instantly stepped forward, his arm extended like a solid steel barricade, physically blocking them from advancing any closer to me. I stopped walking. I did not flinch. I did not retreat. I stood perfectly dry beneath the large umbrella looking at the two women who shared my DNA. My mother dropped her pride entirely. She fell forward, gripping the wet metal barrier of the building's handrail, her face contorting with genuine, unfiltered panic. The manufactured, arrogant matriarch was completely gone, replaced by a terrified, destitute woman facing the horrifying reality of the streets. "We need your help, Paige," Beatrice sobbed, actual tears mixing with the freezing rain streaming down her cheeks. "The bank took the house. They locked me out yesterday. I have nowhere to go. Diana cannot afford a real apartment. We are completely out of options. You have to give us a second chance. We are family, Paige. Blood is thicker than water. Please, I am begging you. I will be homeless by tonight." Diana finally looked up at me, her usual venom completely washed away by sheer misery and the crushing weight of her new motel room reality. "Paige, please," Diana whispered, her teeth visibly chattering. "We have absolutely nothing left." I looked at them. I searched my chest for even a single microscopic flicker of sympathy. There was none. I had completely permanently healed from the deep, agonizing wounds they had spent a lifetime inflicting upon me. The frightened, desperate daughter who had begged for their approval was dead. I was standing in the exact center of my own power, and looking at them now, I felt nothing but absolute freezing indifference. I stepped slightly closer to the edge of the umbrella, ensuring my voice would cut through the heavy storm with crystal clarity. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, immovable gravity of a judge delivering a final sentence. "You called me a worm." I stated, my words falling like heavy frozen stones. "You called me a failure. You chose a lying cheat over your own daughter because you worshipped the illusion of status. You gladly handed a proven fraud $100,000 just to watch me suffer. You wanted to see me destroyed, Beatrice. You actively cheered for my ruin because my independence threatened your toxic manufactured reality." Beatrice let out a pathetic, high-pitched wail, shaking her head frantically in the rain. "No, Paige. I was wrong. I was so wrong." I held up my hand, instantly silencing her. "Don't cling to a failure now, Beatrice," I said, delivering the absolute final blow. I did not wait for a response. I gave Marcus a single definitive nod. He stepped firmly into their path, gently, but immovably blocking Beatrice and Diana from following me a single inch further. I turned my back on them and walked smoothly toward the idling, black-chauffeured luxury SUV waiting at the curb. The driver opened the heavy door and I slid into the warm, quiet, leather-scented interior. The heavy door slammed shut instantly, cutting off the pathetic, desperate sobbing of my mother and sister in the freezing rain. As the luxury SUV pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving them behind forever, my phone buzzed sharply in my briefcase. I pulled it out and glanced at the illuminated screen. It was a text message from Jamal. "Custody secured. Have a great flight to Paris, CEO." I smiled at the screen, locked my phone, and let the gentle hum of the luxury SUV carry me toward the airport. 12 hours later, I was seated in the serene, soundproofed sanctuary of a first-class transatlantic cabin soaring high above the Atlantic Ocean. The soft, ambient lighting illuminated the pristine leather of my suite. I took a slow, deliberate sip of chilled, sparkling water from a crystal glass, letting the absolute quiet of the cabin wash over me. I opened my laptop and connected to the in-flight wireless network. A highly classified email from Richard Sterling was waiting in my secure inbox. The subject line was simply marked as Final Updates. I clicked it open. Richard's legal briefing was clinical, precise, and profoundly satisfying. Declan's desperate attempts to secure a miracle loan had completely failed. He had officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy that very morning. His assets, whatever meager scraps remained after Sloane's thorough pillaging, had been entirely liquidated. To satisfy the crushing court fees and mounting restitution mandates, my former husband was now officially employed at a minimum wage retail job. Richard had included a brief, dryly worded addendum noting that Declan was currently working the stockroom at a discount electronics store, wearing a polyester uniform, spending his days unloading heavy pallets, and enduring the exact kind of mundane, invisible labor he had always believed he was too important to perform. The updates on Sloane were even more severe. Her flawless exit strategy had hit a massive federal brick wall. After abandoning Declan, she had immediately attempted to run her signature con on a wealthy commercial real estate developer in Miami. Unfortunately for her, this new target possessed a dedicated corporate security team. They had instantly flagged her offshore wire transfer requests and notified federal authorities. Sloane was currently under active investigation for multiple counts of wire fraud. Her passport had been seized, her bank accounts were permanently frozen, and she was facing the very real, terrifying prospect of a lengthy federal prison sentence. She had finally played her toxic games with the wrong caliber of people. I read the email twice, ensuring every detail was cataloged, and then I permanently deleted the thread. I closed the email client and turned my gaze toward the small oval window. Below me, an endless blanket of thick white clouds stretched out toward the horizon, illuminated by the brilliant morning sun. I waited for the familiar surge of vindictive triumph to hit my chest. I waited for the dark, heavy anger that had fueled my grueling 16-hour workdays and my ruthless legal strategies to flare up. Nothing came. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of resentment toward Beatrice Diana Declan or Sloane. I felt absolutely nothing. The fiery, consuming rage that had kept me awake for months had entirely evaporated, replaced by a profound, unshakable tranquility. I did not hate my family. Hate required an emotional investment I was no longer willing to make. They were simply strangers who had chosen a path of deceit and toxicity, and the universe had handed them the exact consequences of their own actions. For my entire life, I had been cast in the role of the scapegoat. I had been the designated failure, the punching bag, the convenient excuse for my mother's bitterness and my sister's deep-seated insecurities. I had spent decades contorting myself, desperately trying to earn the love of people who were fundamentally incapable of offering it. But looking down at the world from 30,000 feet, I realized the ultimate truth. The scapegoat had not just escaped the toxic maze. She had burned the maze to the ground and built an empire on its ashes. I was no longer a victim. I was the absolute master of my own destiny. I turned my attention back to my laptop screen. I opened my encrypted corporate drive and brought up the digital blueprints for Apex Solutions. This was not just a quarterly projection. It was the comprehensive master strategy for our European expansion. I scrolled through the detailed logistical schematics, the massive market capture algorithms, and the aggressive timelines for opening our new headquarters in Paris, London, and Berlin. My fingers flew across the keyboard, adjusting data points and refining the operational budgets. For years, my intense work ethic had been a desperate shield. I had used my ambition as a blunt weapon to prove my worth to a family that was completely committed to misunderstanding me. Every contract I won, every promotion I secured had been a silent plea for their respect. That motivation was entirely gone. I was no longer working to prove anything to anyone. I was looking at the European expansion blueprints and feeling the pure, unadulterated joy of creation. I was building this global infrastructure because I possessed the brilliance to do so. I was expanding my empire because I thrived on the intellectual challenge. I was doing it entirely unapologetically for myself. As I finalized the architectural layouts for the new Paris office, a soft, polite voice interrupted my focus. Excuse me, Ms. Page. I looked up. The lead flight attendant was standing beside my suite, her hands clasped respectfully in front of her. She offered a warm, professional smile. I am so sorry to interrupt your work, she said, her voice dropping to a discreet, gentle volume. But the pilot noticed your name on the passenger manifest. He asked me to come back here and thank you personally. I tilted my head, genuinely surprised. Thank me for what? Your company's software. The flight attendant explained, her smile widening into something deeply sincere. His brother owns a mid-sized logistics firm in Chicago. They were on the verge of total bankruptcy last year. They integrated the Apex Solutions supply chain protocol, and it completely saved his brother's business. He said your work saved his family from financial ruin, and he just wanted to make sure you knew how grateful he is. I sat perfectly still, letting her words wash over me. I smiled gently, nodding my head. Please tell the captain he is very welcome and that I deeply appreciate the message. She bowed her head slightly and retreated to the galley, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I reached for my crystal glass and took a final sip of sparkling water. A deep, resonant warmth bloomed in my chest. Beatrice and Diana had spent their lives worshipping empty status symbols, chasing the shallow, hollow approval of a high society illusion. Declan had destroyed his life chasing a fake, manufactured prestige. They had all scrambled in the dirt, fighting over pennies and fake crowns. Meanwhile, I had quietly built something real. I had built something that changed lives, saved businesses, and shifted the actual landscape of the corporate world. The ultimate revenge was never about destroying them. Their own greed had done that for me. The ultimate revenge was outgrowing them entirely. It was becoming a titan in a world they could never even dream of entering. I turned back to my laptop, ready to conquer Europe. Fade to black.